6 men, 1 woman, a derringer with only 2 bullets. When Charlotte McKenna walked into the Silver Star Saloon that stormy Arizona night, she had no idea she was stepping into a trap that would change her life forever. What happened in those next terrifying minutes, and the mysterious cowboy who watched from the shadows, would set in motion a chain of events involving gunfights, forbidden desire, and a desperate flight toward freedom. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The storm hit Tombstone like God's own fury. Charlotte McKenna stood under the awning of Harrington's General Store watching sheets of rain turn the dusty main street into a river of mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the false-fronted buildings in harsh white flashes, and thunder rolled across the desert hills like distant artillery. Her mare Delilah, tied to the hitching post, tossed her head nervously with each thunderclap. Charlotte pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the evening air was warm and thick with moisture. At 32 years old, she'd lived through enough Arizona storms to know this one would last hours, not minutes. The clouds overhead were the color of old bruises, and the wind carried that particular electric smell that promised a long, violent night. She'd come to town for supplies, flour salt ammunition for the Winchester, and a new leather harness strap that had broken that morning. The Circle M Ranch sat 12 miles south of Tombstone, 12 miles of rough terrain that would be treacherous in this weather. The dry washes would be running full already, and in the dark a horse could easily step wrong and break a leg. No, she'd have to wait it out. Charlotte looked down the street considering her options. Most of the shops had already closed, their owners having seen the storm coming and headed home early. The hotel would be the sensible choice. She had enough money for a room, and Mrs. Patterson, who ran the place, was respectable enough. But Charlotte knew how quickly tongues wagged in Tombstone. A widow staying overnight in town without her foreman or ranch hands, the gossips would have a field day. 3 years. 3 years since Thomas had died thrown from a spooked horse during a lightning storm not unlike this one. His neck had broken instantly, the doctor said. No suffering. That was supposed to be a comfort, but Charlotte had found precious little comfort in anything since that day. She'd buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together under a cottonwood tree where they'd once sat and planned their future. She'd kept the ranch running through sheer stubbornness and pride. Most folks in Tombstone had expected her to sell out within 6 months. A woman alone couldn't possibly manage a cattle operation, they'd said. But Charlotte had proved them wrong. She'd hired good men, learned to handle the books herself, and made the Circle M profitable, even as other ranches failed. But it had come at a cost. She was always on guard, always proving herself, always aware that she was a woman in a man's world. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders every single day. Another crash of thunder made the decision for her. The Silver Star Saloon sat just across the street, its windows glowing with warm lamplight. Not respectable for a lady, perhaps, but it would be dry and she could order coffee and a meal while she waited. The saloon owner, Pete Murphy, was decent enough. He ran a relatively clean establishment and didn't allow the worst kind of rowdiness. Charlotte gathered her skirts and made a dash across the muddy street, her boots splashing through puddles. She pushed through the swinging doors of the Silver Star and immediately felt a dozen pairs of eyes turned toward her. The saloon was more crowded than she'd expected. Men lined the bar hunched over glasses of whiskey and beer. Others sat at tables playing cards or talking in low voices. The air was thick with tobacco smoke, and the smell of sawdust spilled liquor and unwashed bodies. A piano sat silent in the corner. Pete must not have hired a player this week. Charlotte held her head high and walked toward an empty table near the back wall, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her. She knew what they were saying. Decent women didn't come into saloons. Decent women stayed home where they belonged. But Charlotte had stopped caring much about what people thought was decent. "Mrs. McKenna!" Pete Murphy appeared at her table, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a barrel-chested Irishman with gray in his beard and kind eyes. "Wasn't expecting to see you tonight." "Storm caught me in town," Charlotte said, keeping her voice steady and pleasant. "I was hoping I could wait it out here. Coffee and whatever you have for supper." Pete glanced around the room, and Charlotte saw concern flicker across his face. "Course you can, ma'am. Got beef stew and biscuits tonight. I'll bring it right out." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Might be best if you sat closer to the bar, though. I could keep an eye." "I'm fine here, Pete. Thank you." He nodded reluctantly and headed back toward the kitchen, leaving Charlotte alone at her table against the back wall. She arranged her skirts carefully, making sure the small bulge of the derringer in her pocket wasn't visible. Thomas had given her the little pistol on their first anniversary. "Not much good past arm's length," he'd said. "But if trouble gets that close, 2 .41 caliber rounds will stop most anything." She'd carried it ever since, and in 3 years she'd never had to draw it. But she'd come close a few times. Close enough to know that being a woman alone meant being a target. The conversations around her gradually resumed, though Charlotte felt the occasional glance in her direction. She kept her eyes on the table, her hands folded in her lap, projecting an air of calm indifference even as her senses stayed alert. She was aware of every person in the room, the cowhands at the bar probably from one of the outfits up north. The gamblers at the corner table focused on their cards. A handful of townsmen. She recognized the clerk from the land office, one of the bank tellers, a couple of merchants. And there, sitting alone at a table near the front window, a man she didn't recognize. He was younger than most of the patrons, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a lean, weathered face. He wore range clothes, dusty jeans, a plain cotton shirt, worn boots. But something about the way he carried himself suggested more than just another drifting cowhand. He sat with his back to the wall, his eyes watchful, and there was a stillness about him that reminded Charlotte of the way predators waited before they struck. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Charlotte felt an odd jolt of recognition, even though she was certain she'd never seen him before. Then he looked away, returning his attention to the whiskey glass in front of him. Pete brought her coffee and stew, and Charlotte focused on her meal, grateful for something to do with her hands. The stew was hot and surprisingly good thick with chunks of beef and vegetables. The coffee was strong and bitter the way she liked it. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Rain hammered against the roof and windows, and the wind made the hanging oil lamp sway slightly, casting moving shadows across the walls. Charlotte was halfway through her meal when the door opened and 6 men walked in. She recognized the one in front immediately, and her stomach tightened. Jack Branson. He was a merchant who owned one of the larger dry goods stores in Tombstone, a man in his early 40s with slicked back hair and a carefully groomed mustache. He dressed well, too well for Tombstone, in a suit that must have cost more than most cowboys made in 6 months. He thought highly of himself, Charlotte knew. Thought he was better than the ranchers and miners and working men who made up most of the town's population. He'd been trying to buy the Circle M for 2 years now, making increasingly aggressive offers. Charlotte had turned him down every time, and with each rejection, his manner had grown colder, his comments more cutting. Last month at the church social, he'd cornered her outside and suggested in a voice thick with insinuation that a woman in her position needed a man to look after her interests, that she was being foolish trying to run a ranch alone, that people were talking about her, wondering about her morals, about what exactly went on at the Circle M with all those hired men and no husband to keep things proper. Charlotte had looked him in the eye and told him in explicit terms what he could do with his concerns and his offers. Now, as Jack Branson spotted her across the saloon, she saw the smile that spread across his face, and her hand moved instinctively toward the pocket where the derringer rested. The 5 men with him were rough types, not his usual business associates. 2 of them looked like hired muscle, thick-necked and mean-eyed. The others had the weathered look of men who worked outdoors, but there was something predatory about them, something that set Charlotte's nerves jangling. "Well, well," Branson said loudly, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the saloon. "Mrs. McKenna, what a pleasant surprise." The conversations around the room died down. Men turned to watch, sensing drama. Charlotte set down her coffee cup slowly, carefully. "Mr. Branson." He walked toward her table, his men following. The way they moved, positioning themselves to block her exit, told Charlotte this wasn't a chance encounter. They'd known she was here. Pete Murphy started forward from behind the bar, but one of Branson's men gave him a look that stopped him cold. "Terrible weather to be out," Branson said, stopping just a few feet from her table. "A woman alone shouldn't be traveling in such conditions. Dangerous." I can take care of myself," Charlotte said evenly. "Can you—" Branson's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "I wonder about that. I've been hearing concerning things, Mrs. McKenna, about your ranch, about your situation. My situation is none of your concern. But that's where you're wrong." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her without being invited. His men closed in around the table. See when a woman is struggling, when she's making poor decisions that affect property values and the business climate of this community, it becomes everyone's concern. Charlotte's jaw tightened. The Circle M is doing just fine. Is it? Branson leaned back in his chair, making a show of getting comfortable. Because I've heard you're behind on your loan payments at the bank. I've heard you lost 30 head of cattle last month to rustlers. I've heard your hands are talking about leaving because you can't pay them properly. Each statement was a lie, but Charlotte knew how rumors worked in a town like Tombstone. Repeat a lie often enough and people started to believe it. You've heard wrong, she said. Maybe. Maybe not. Branson reached out suddenly and put his hand over hers on the table. His palm was damp and hot. But either way, I'm prepared to make you another offer. A very generous offer. Enough to pay off any debt, set you up somewhere comfortable. Maybe San Francisco, I hear it's nice for ladies who want to start over. Charlotte pulled her hand back, her skin crawling. I'm not interested. You should be. His voice hardened. You should be very interested, Charlotte. The use of her first name was a deliberate insult, a breach of propriety meant to show his disrespect. Around them, the saloon had gone completely quiet. Even the storm seemed to fade into background noise. You need to leave my table, Charlotte said quietly. Or what? Branson's smile turned ugly. You'll call for help. Look around, Charlotte. Nobody here is going to help you. Half these men agree with me. A woman has no business running a ranch. The other half are too drunk or too scared to get involved. He leaned forward, and Charlotte caught the smell of whiskey on his breath. He'd been drinking before he came here, working up his courage. Here's what's going to happen, Branson continued in a low, intense voice. You're going to accept my offer. You're going to sign over the deed to the Circle M. And if you're smart, if you're very smart, you'll do it gracefully. Because if you don't, he gestured to the men around him. Well, accidents happen, especially to women alone on isolated ranches. Fires, floods, raiders, so many terrible things that can befall someone who doesn't have proper protection. It was a threat, clear and unmistakable. Charlotte felt her heart hammering in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. You're threatening me. In front of witnesses. Branson laughed. Witnesses? I don't see any witnesses. I see men who know how the world works. Men who understand that sometimes things need to be corrected, set right. He reached out again faster this time and grabbed her wrist. Now, are you going to be reasonable? His grip was tight enough to hurt. Charlotte felt the panic rising in her throat, the fear that she'd fought so hard to master over the past 3 years. She was trapped, surrounded with half a dozen hostile men between her and the door. But she was also Thomas McKenna's widow, and she'd learned a few things about survival. Her free hand moved under the table, slipping into her pocket fingers, closing around the carved wooden grip of the derringer. Let go of me, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Or what? Branson tightened his grip, leaning closer. What are you going to do? Charlotte screamed cry. That's what women do when they're in over their heads, isn't it? They cry and hope some man will... Charlotte pulled the derringer free and pressed the twin barrels against his chest right over his heart. The little pistol was barely 6 inches long, but at this range it was deadly. The color drained from Branson's face. Let go, Charlotte repeated. Around them chairs scraped back. Men stood up, hands moving toward guns. The 5 men with Branson tensed, ready to move. You wouldn't dare, Branson whispered, but his voice shook. Wouldn't I? Charlotte held his gaze, and she let him see the steel in her eyes, the absolute willingness to pull that trigger. I'm a widow alone on an isolated ranch, remember? Who would blame me for being nervous? Who would blame me for accidentally shooting a man who was threatening me, who had me cornered and surrounded? Pete Murphy's voice cut through the tension. She's right, Jack. You let her go right now, or I'm calling the marshal. I heard every word you said, and I'll testify to it. Branson's eyes darted around the room, gauging the situation. Whatever he saw in the faces around him made him reconsider. Slowly, very slowly, he released Charlotte's wrist and raised his hands. This isn't over, he said softly. Not even close. Yes, Charlotte said, standing up with the derringer still pointed at his chest. It is. You're going to walk out of here, you and your men, and you're never going to approach me again. You're never going to threaten me again.
Because if you do, Mr. Branson, I promise you I will kill you. She meant it, every word, and he knew it. Branson stood slowly, his hands still raised. His face was flushed with anger and humiliation, but he kept his mouth shut. He gestured to his men, and they backed away from the table, creating a path to the door. As they filed out into the storm, Branson paused at the door and looked back.
"You've made a serious mistake tonight, Mrs. McKenna. A very serious mistake." Then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him. Charlotte stood there for a long moment, the derringer still in her hand, her entire body shaking with adrenaline. Around her, the saloon erupted in whispers and murmurs. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Pete breathed, coming around the bar. "Are you all right?" Charlotte managed a nod, though her legs felt weak. She carefully uncocked the derringer and slipped it back into her pocket. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. Not really, because she knew Jack Branson knew men like him. He wouldn't let this go. He wouldn't accept the public humiliation she'd just dealt him. He would come after her, and next time he wouldn't be drunk and careless. Next time he would be prepared. "You need to report this to Marshal White," Pete said urgently. "What he did, what he said, that's criminal threatening. You have witnesses." Charlotte shook her head. "You think the marshal will do anything? Branson's got half the town council in his pocket. He'll say it was all a misunderstanding, that I overreacted." She looked at Pete. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing. Consider it on the house." Pete glanced toward the window where rain still streamed down the glass. "The storm's easing up some. You want me to get someone to ride with you back to your ranch?" "No, I'll be fine." But as Charlotte turned to leave, she became aware of movement near the front of the saloon. The young man who'd been sitting alone stood up, blocking her path. Up close, she could see him more clearly. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with broad shoulders and calloused hands. His face was lean and serious, with deep-set eyes that seemed to take in everything. There was a gun on his hip, a Colt Peacemaker that looked well-maintained and well-used. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet and respectful, "if you don't mind me saying, riding alone tonight might not be the smartest move." Charlotte bristled automatically. "I don't recall asking your opinion." "No, ma'am, you didn't." He didn't seem offended. "But those men who just left, they didn't get on horses and ride away. They're standing across the street under the livery awning watching this door." Charlotte felt her stomach drop. She moved to the window and looked out, and sure enough, she could see dark shapes huddled together in the rain, waiting. "They mean to follow you, pet," the stranger continued. "Maybe try to catch you on the road when there's no witnesses around. After what happened here, they can't let it stand." "So what do you suggest?" Charlotte asked, frustrated and frightened and trying not to show either emotion. "I suggest you let me ride with you. 2 of us will make them think twice about trying anything." Charlotte studied him carefully. "And who are you? Why would you help me?" "Name's Ethan Cole." "As for why," he shrugged. "Let's just say I don't take kindly to men who threaten women, and I don't have anywhere particular to be tonight." There was something in his eyes, something honest and direct, that made Charlotte want to trust him, but she'd learned to be cautious. "What do you want in return?" she asked bluntly. "Nothing." He met her gaze steadily. "Though if you're hiring hands at your ranch, I wouldn't mind hearing about it. Been looking for work since I got to Tombstone last week." Pete Murphy spoke up. "I've seen him around town, Mrs. McKenna. He's been doing odd jobs staying at the boarding house. Haven't heard anything bad about him." It wasn't much of a recommendation, but Charlotte didn't have many options. If Branson's men were really out there waiting, she couldn't make it back to the ranch alone. And she couldn't stay in town, not after tonight. The gossip would be unbearable, and it would just give Branson more ammunition to use against her reputation. "All right," she said finally. "But just to be clear, Mr. Cole, if you try anything at all, I will shoot you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair enough, ma'am." 20 minutes later, Charlotte and Ethan Cole rode out of Tombstone side by side, the storm having diminished to a steady rain. Charlotte was mounted on Delilah, while Ethan rode a rangy buckskin gelding that looked as tough and no-nonsense as its owner. They'd barely cleared the edge of town when Charlotte spotted them 3 riders following at a distance, dark shapes against the darker night. "I see them," Ethan said quietly, not turning around. "Just keep riding steady. Don't let them know we've spotted them." Charlotte's hand moved to her pocket, touching the derringer for reassurance, but she knew the little pistol would be useless at range. If it came to shooting, Ethan would have to handle it. They rode in silence for a while, the rain soaking through Charlotte's clothes and the mud sucking at the horses' hooves. The road south was treacherous, even in good weather, narrow in places with steep drop-offs on one side and rocky cliffs on the other. In the dark and rain, it was downright dangerous. "How much farther to your ranch?" Ethan asked. 8 miles, maybe 9. There's a shortcut through Cooper's Canyon that would save us an hour, but it'll be running with water tonight. These men know about the shortcut. Probably. Ethan was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then we take the long way. Stay on the main road where there's less chance of an ambush. Charlotte didn't argue. She was cold and wet and exhausted, her nerves still jangling from the confrontation in the saloon. Part of her couldn't believe any of this was happening. Just a few hours ago, she'd been worried about fixing a harness strap. Now she was running for her life. Behind them, the 3 riders maintained their distance, neither closing in nor falling back. Watching. Waiting. "Tell me about your ranch," and Ethan said, his voice casual, but Charlotte understood he was trying to keep her calm, keep her talking. Circle M. 3,000 acres, about 500 head of cattle. Good water, good grass. My husband and I built it from nothing 10 years ago. She paused. He died 3 years back. I'm sorry. So am I. Charlotte wiped rain from her face. What about you? Where are you from? Originally Kansas, but I've been all over. Spent time in the cavalry after the war, then worked on ranches from Texas to Montana. Why'd you leave the cavalry? Served my time. Wanted to do something else. There was more to the story Charlotte could tell, but she didn't press. Everyone had secrets, and she had no right to his. They rode on the horses, plodding through the mud, the rain a constant drumbeat on Charlotte's hat. Her thighs ached from gripping the saddle, and her fingers were numb with cold despite the warm night air. An hour passed. 2. The riders behind them stayed constant, a threatening presence that never quite materialized into action. Finally, Charlotte saw the familiar landmarks, the lightning-struck pine that marked the northern boundary of her property, the creek that ran along the eastern fence line, now swollen and rushing with storm water. Almost there, she said, relief flooding through her. Another mile to the ranch house. But as they crested a rise, Ethan suddenly held up his hand. Stop! Charlotte reined in Delilah. What is it? The riders behind us just split up. 2 went east, 1 went west. His voice was tight with tension. They're trying to get ahead of us, set up an ambush. Charlotte's throat went dry. We need to run for it. No, in this mud, we'd just tire the horses and they'd catch us for sure. Ethan looked around, his eyes scanning the darkness. Is there anywhere nearby we could hole up somewhere defensible? Charlotte thought quickly. There's an old line shack about half a mile east. Stone walls, good sight lines. We used to use it during Roundup, but it's been empty for a year. That'll do. Lead the way, but stay behind me. They turned off the main road, following a barely visible trail that cut through scrub brush and stands of mesquite. Charlotte's heart hammered in her chest. Every shadow looked like a threat, every sound like approaching danger. The line shack appeared out of the darkness like a gift from God, a small stone structure with a sagging roof and a single door. Ethan dismounted quickly and checked inside, then gestured for Charlotte to follow. Tie the horses on the far side out of sight, he said quietly. Then get inside. Charlotte did as he instructed, her fingers fumbling with Delilah's reins. The mare sensed her fear and danced nervously, but Charlotte finally got her secured next to Ethan's buckskin. Inside the shack, it was pitch black and smelled of old hay and mouse droppings. Charlotte stood just inside the door, trying to catch her breath, while Ethan moved around the small space, checking the walls and the single glassless window. Good walls, he said. They'll have to come through the door or the window, and we can cover both from here. He moved to the window and looked out. Can't see much in this rain, but that works both ways. They can't see us either. Charlotte fumbled in her pocket and pulled out the Derringer. In the darkness, it felt smaller and more inadequate than ever. 2 shots. That was all she had. Ethan saw the gesture and moved closer. You know how to use that point and shoot. Not much more to it than that. You ever shot at a person before? Charlotte hesitated. No. It's different from shooting targets or game. Just remember, if it comes to it, don't hesitate. Men like that, they won't give you a second chance. I know. Her voice sounded small in the darkness. They waited. Minutes crawled by like hours. The rain continued its steady percussion on the roof, and somewhere nearby a horse whinnied one of their own mounts, nervous in the storm. Then Charlotte heard it, the sound of riders approaching, moving slowly and cautiously. Ethan tensed beside her. 3 of them, coming from the north. Charlotte's grip tightened on the derringer. She could see nothing through the window, just darkness and rain, but she could hear them now, the creak of saddle leather, the splash of hooves in mud. They were close, very close. A voice called out through the rain, distorted by distance and wind. "Mrs. McKenna." "We know you're in there. Mr. Branson just wants to talk." Ethan made a slight gesture. "Stay quiet." Charlotte pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. "We're not going to hurt you," the voice continued. "Just come out and we'll escort you safely back to town. Mr. Branson is worried about you being out here in this storm with some stranger." The lie was so brazen it would have been funny if the situation weren't so terrifying. Ethan moved to the door, positioning himself where he could see out through the gap between the door and the frame. His hand rested on his Colt, ready, but not drawn. "There's 3 of them," he whispered, "spread out about 30 yards away. They're not sure if we're really in here." Another minute of silence. Charlotte could barely breathe. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight, waiting. Then one of the men made a decision. "We're coming in." "Don't do anything stupid." Charlotte heard splashing footsteps approaching. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of movement, a dark shape getting closer. Ethan drew his Colt in one smooth motion. The door crashed open. And in the muzzle flash that followed, Charlotte's world exploded into chaos. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space of the stone shack. Charlotte saw the man in the doorway jerk backward, his chest blooming dark with blood. His surprised face caught in the muzzle flash for just an instant before he fell. The crash of his body hitting the mud outside seemed to echo forever, mixing with the thunder that rolled across the desert sky. "Get down!" Ethan shouted, and Charlotte dropped to the floor just as bullets began punching through the doorway, splintering the old wood frame. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the whine of ricochets off stone. Ethan fired twice more through the door-controlled shots that weren't aimed at shadows, but at calculated positions where men would take cover. Charlotte heard a cry of pain from outside, then cursing, then the sound of someone scrambling away through the brush. "Window!" Ethan barked, and Charlotte understood instantly. She crawled across the dirt floor to the glassless opening, keeping low, her derringer clutched in both hands. Her whole body was shaking so badly she wasn't sure she could aim, but she forced herself to peer over the windowsill into the rain-swept darkness. A shape moved near a stand of mesquite 20 yards out. Charlotte didn't hesitate. She just pointed the derringer and pulled the trigger. The little pistol bucked in her hand, the report sharp and angry. She couldn't tell if she'd hit anything, but the shape disappeared, dropping flat or running, she couldn't tell which. "One bullet left," she called to Ethan, her voice steadier than she felt. "Make it count," he replied, ejecting spent cartridges from his Colt and reloading with practiced efficiency. His hands moved in the darkness like he'd done this 1,000 times before, and Charlotte realized that he probably had. Whatever Ethan Cole's story was, it involved more than just working cattle. Outside, the shooting had stopped. The rain continued its steady rhythm, washing the blood from the doorway into the mud. Charlotte could hear her own breathing, harsh and rapid, and the pounding of her heart. "How many left?" she whispered. "2, maybe 1, if you hit your target. But they'll be cautious now. They know we're armed and willing to shoot." Ethan moved to the window beside her, careful to stay out of sight. "Question is, are they willing to die for whatever Branson's paying them?" As if in answer, a voice called out from the darkness. "You killed Ray, you son of a bitch! You're gonna pay for that." "Your friend drew on me," Ethan shouted back. "He came through that door with a gun in his hand. That's self-defense, and every law in Arizona will back me up." "Law don't mean shit out here. You think anyone's gonna care about some drifter and a whore who—" Ethan fired toward the voice, cutting off the insult. "Next man who disrespects Mrs. McKenna gets a bullet in the mouth. Now you boys have a choice. You can ride away right now, and we'll call it even. Or you can keep pushing, and I guarantee more of you will die." Silence. Just the rain and the distant rumble of thunder moving east. Charlotte pressed her back against the stone wall. trying to control her breathing. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her skin, and mud caked her boots and hem. The Derringer felt slippery in her sweating palm. She couldn't believe she'd actually shot at someone. Couldn't believe any of this was happening. 3 years of running the Circle M, 3 years of proving herself, of building something solid and respectable, and now she was crouched in a line shack trading gunfire with hired killers in the middle of the night, because Jack Branson couldn't stand being told no by a woman. "They're moving," Ethan said quietly, his eyes fixed on something Charlotte couldn't see, backing off toward their horses. "Are they leaving?" "Don't know. Could be regrouping, could be giving up." He glanced at her, and even in the darkness she could see the intensity in his eyes. "Either way, we need to move. Can't stay here. They might come back with more men and we'd be trapped." Charlotte nodded, though every muscle in her body ached at the thought of getting back on a horse. "The ranch house is only a mile from here. We can make it." "That's the first place they'll look if they come back. It's got thick walls and real doors that lock. Better than this." Charlotte moved toward the doorway, stepping carefully around the pooling blood. "And I've got a rifle there, Winchester 73. Better than this useless Derringer." Ethan caught her arm gently. "Mrs. McKenna, Charlotte, that man you shot at, you did good. You kept your head, you defended yourself. A lot of people freeze up their first time." Charlotte looked down at the Derringer in her hand, at the one remaining bullet. "I don't feel good. I feel sick. That's normal. That's how decent people feel after violence." He released her arm. "But you're alive, and that's what matters. Now let's get you home." They retrieved their horses from behind the shack, both animals nervous and skittish from the gunfire. Charlotte mounted Delilah with trembling legs, and they set off through the rain toward the ranch house, moving quickly but cautiously, Ethan's eyes constantly scanning the darkness for threats. The storm was finally breaking. The rain had diminished to a drizzle, and gaps appeared in the clouds overhead, revealing stars. By the time they reached the boundary of the Circle M's main compound, the moon was trying to break through, casting everything in uncertain silver light. Charlotte's ranch house sat on a slight rise, a sturdy adobe structure with a covered porch and shuttered windows. Behind it sprawled the barn, the bunkhouse corrals, and various outbuildings. Normally there would be lamps burning, ranch hands moving about their evening business. But tonight, everything was dark and still. "Where are your men?" Ethan asked, his hand resting on his Colt. "Gave them the evening off. Sent them into town for the Saturday social." Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. If Branson had known she'd be alone tonight, he'd planned this carefully. "They won't be back until tomorrow." Ethan didn't say anything, but she saw his jaw tighten. They approached the house slowly, and Ethan dismounted first, checking the porch and the front door before gesturing for Charlotte to follow. The door was locked just as she'd left it. Charlotte fumbled with her key, her fingers still shaking, and finally got it open. Inside the house was dark and quiet, but it felt safe, her space, her territory. She moved through the familiar rooms without needing a lamp, while Ethan stood in the doorway, watching the yard. "I need to see to Delilah," Charlotte said, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "I'll do it. You lock this door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me." Ethan started to turn away, then stopped. "You have that Winchester loaded." "Always." "Get it. Keep it close." After he left, Charlotte locked the door and leaned against it, her eyes closed, letting the silence of the house wash over her. She was home. She was safe. For now. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Charlotte moved through the dark house to her bedroom, found the Winchester leaning in the corner where she always kept it, and checked the load. 16 rounds in the tube magazine, 1 in the chamber. Enough to hold off a small army if it came to that. She caught sight of herself in the mirror above her dresser and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in wet tangles around her face. Her dress was ruined, caked with mud and torn at the hem. There was a smear of something dark on her cheek, blood maybe, or just dirt. But it was her eyes that shocked her most. They looked wild, haunted, like the eyes of a cornered animal. Charlotte turned away from the mirror and went to the window, peering out through the shutters at the moonlit yard. She could see Ethan leading both horses toward the barn, moving with economical grace despite his own exhaustion. He'd saved her life tonight. She owed him a debt she wasn't sure she could ever repay. 20 minutes later, a quiet knock came at the door.
Mrs. McKenna, it's Ethan. Horses are settled. Charlotte opened the door and stepped back to let him in. In the lamplight now burning in her parlor, she could see him more clearly. His clothes were as muddy and wet as hers, his face drawn with fatigue. There was a cut on his left cheek she hadn't noticed before, probably from a stone chip during the shooting. "You're hurt," she said. He touched his face absently. "Just a scratch. I've had worse." Charlotte set the Winchester against the wall and moved to the kitchen. Her hands were steadier now, having something practical to do. "Coffee, I need to make some anyway. I don't think I'll be sleeping tonight." Coffee would be good. While Charlotte worked at the stove, Ethan stood by the window, watching the yard. She was acutely aware of his presence in her home, the first man besides ranch hands on business to set foot in her house since Thomas died. It felt strange, intimate in a way that made her uncomfortable. "They won't come tonight," Ethan said as if sensing her thoughts. "They're hurt and scared. They'll report back to Branson and he'll have to decide his next move. That'll take time." "How much time?" "Day or two, maybe. Depends on how determined he is." Charlotte poured coffee into 2 tin cups, her best china seeming ridiculous after the night they'd had. She handed one to Ethan and sat down at her kitchen table, suddenly so tired she could barely hold her head up. "I can't thank you enough for what you did tonight," she said quietly. "You didn't have to help me. You could have walked away." Ethan took a sip of coffee and grimaced at the heat. "Couldn't do that." "Why not?" "You don't know me. This isn't your fight." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his cup. "My mother was a widow. When I was 12, some men tried to force her off our land in Kansas, wanted to buy it cheap, said a woman alone couldn't handle a farm. She refused, and they made her life hell, killed livestock, burned crops, harassed her every time she went to town. What happened? I got old enough to fight back. Killed one of them when I was 16, caught him trying to burn our barn. The law called it self-defense, but the dead man's family didn't see it that way. Had to leave Kansas after that." Ethan's voice was flat factual, but Charlotte heard the old pain underneath. "So when I see men like Branson trying to force out women like you, I guess I see my mother. And I can't walk away from that." Charlotte felt tears prickling her eyes, and she blinked them back angrily. She'd cried enough over the past 3 years. "Where's your mother now?" "Dead, 5 years ago, pneumonia." He finally looked up at her. "But she kept that farm, never let them break her. Sold it on her own terms, used the money to open a boarding house in town. Died in her own bed, successful and respected. That's how she wanted it. She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was." Ethan drained his coffee and stood. "I should go. You need rest, and I need to find somewhere to bed down for the night." "You can use the bunkhouse," Charlotte said quickly. "It's empty, but there are beds and blankets. In the morning, we can talk about that job you mentioned." Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude. "You sure after tonight might not look good, me staying on your property?" "After tonight, I don't much care what people think looks good." Charlotte stood as well, swaying slightly with exhaustion. "You risked your life for me. The least I can do is offer you a job." "All right, then." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Mrs. McKenna, Charlotte, lock this door behind me. Keep that Winchester close. And if you hear anything at all, you shoot first and ask questions later. Understand?" "I understand." After he left, Charlotte locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. She checked every window, made sure every shutter was latched. Then she carried the Winchester to her bedroom and laid it on the bed beside her. She didn't bother changing out of her ruined dress. She just lay down on top of the covers, the rifle within easy reach, and stared at the ceiling while her mind replayed every moment of the night, the confrontation in the saloon, the ride through the storm, the shooting at the line shack, the sick feeling when she'd pulled the trigger of the Derringer. She'd almost died tonight. If Ethan Cole hadn't been in that saloon, if he hadn't offered to ride with her, she'd be dead in a ditch somewhere, and Jack Branson would be making plans to claim the Circle M. The thought made her furious. 3 years of work of sweat and struggle and loneliness, and it could have ended because some small-minded merchant couldn't stand being told no. Well, she'd told him no with a Derringer pressed to his chest, and she'd tell him no with the Winchester if he came back. The Circle M was hers. Thomas had died for it,
and she'd be damned if she let Jack Branson or anyone else take it from her. Charlotte finally fell asleep as dawn was breaking, the Winchester cradled in her arms like a lover. She woke to bright sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of voices in the yard. For a moment, panic seized her. They'd come back. Branson's men had come back, but then she recognized the voices as her ranch hands returning from town. Charlotte rose stiffly, every muscle in her body aching, and went to the window. Below, she could see 4 men unsaddling horses at the corral. Charlie Bennett, her foreman, a grizzled 50-year-old with a bad leg from a horse wreck, Miguel Torres, her best wrangler, and the 2 younger hands, Bobby and Sam. And standing with them helping with the horses was Ethan Cole. Charlotte quickly changed into fresh clothes, wincing at the bruises on her wrist where Branson had grabbed her and pinned her hair back into some semblance of order. She splashed water on her face, trying to wash away the exhaustion, then headed out to face her men. They looked up as she approached, and she saw the questions in their eyes. Charlie stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "Mrs. McKenna, we just heard the craziest story in town this morning. Some men saying you pulled a gun on Jack Branson in the Silver Star last night. That true?" Charlotte glanced at Ethan, who stood quietly beside the corral fence, then back at Charlie. "It's true. Mr. Branson and 6 men cornered me in the saloon, threatened me, tried to force me to sell the ranch. I defended myself." "Jesus Christ," Charlie breathed. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Thanks to Mr. Cole here." She gestured to Ethan. "He rode back with me last night. Good thing, too, 3 of Branson's men tried to ambush us on the road. There was shooting." The 4 ranch hands went very still, their faces hardening. "Anyone hurt?" Miguel asked, his hand dropping unconsciously to the gun at his hip. "One of them is dead. I don't know about the other 2. Charlotte kept her voice steady. "I wanted to tell you all directly because you deserve to know what you're staying for. Jack Branson isn't going to let this go. There'll be more trouble, maybe a lot of it. If any of you want to draw your pay and leave, I'll understand. I won't hold it against you." The men exchanged glances. Charlie spat in the dust and shook his head. "Hell, Mrs. McKenna, you think we'd run out on you? You've been square with us when a lot of other outfits were letting men go. You've paid on time, treated us fair. We ain't going anywhere." "Charlie's right," Miguel added. "You need men to watch your back, we're here." Bobby and Sam nodded agreement, and Charlotte felt a rush of gratitude so strong it almost brought tears to her eyes again. "Thank you, all of you." "What do you need us to do?" Charlie asked. Charlotte thought quickly. "Double watches from now on. 2 men on guard at night rotating shifts. Make sure all the weapons are cleaned and loaded. Check the fences, make sure we don't have any weak points where someone could drive off cattle or sneak in. And I want everyone to go armed at all times, even around the ranch." "You expecting an attack?" Miguel's eyes were sharp. "I don't know what to expect, but I'd rather be prepared." Charlotte turned to Ethan. "Mr. Cole, if the offer still stands, I'd like to hire you on. $1 a day plus meals and a bunk in the main house. I need someone I can trust close by." Charlie raised an eyebrow at the mention of the main house, but he didn't comment. Ethan nodded slowly. "Offer stands," he said. "I'll take it." "Good." Charlotte looked at her assembled men 5 now, with Ethan, and felt marginally better about her chances. "Charlie, you're still foreman. Mr. Cole reports to you on regular ranch work. But when it comes to security, to keeping this place safe, he's in charge of that. He's got military experience, and we need that right now." If Charlie was offended by this arrangement, he didn't show it. "Fair enough. Cole, you and me should talk about how we want to set up these watches." As the men dispersed to their various duties, Ethan lingered behind. "That was well done," he said quietly. "You told them the truth, gave them a choice, but made sure they knew you expected them to stay. That's good leadership." "My father was a sergeant in the Union Army," Charlotte said. "He taught me that men respect honesty and clear orders, though I'm sure he never imagined I'd be using those lessons to run a ranch." "Where is he now?" "Dead. He and my mother both. Yellow fever 10 years ago." Charlotte looked out over her land at the rolling hills and distant mountains. "Thomas and I came west right after that. Nothing to keep us in Virginia anymore. We wanted to build something new, something that was just ours." "You built it," Ethan said, "and you'll keep it." Charlotte hoped he was right. The day passed in a flurry of activity. Charlie and Ethan organized the watch schedule while Miguel and the younger hands checked every fence line, every gate, every possible entry point to the property. Charlotte spent the afternoon going over her accounts, making sure she had enough cash on hand to hire more men if necessary, writing letters to neighboring ranchers asking them to be alert for trouble. By evening, she was exhausted again, but it was a different kind of exhaustion than the night before, productive fatigue instead of traumatic shock. She fixed supper for Ethan in her kitchen, feeling strange about having him in her space, but also oddly comfortable. He moved quietly, didn't intrude, was helpful without being overbearing. They ate in companionable silence, and afterward Ethan insisted on cleaning up while Charlotte sat on her porch and watched the sun set over her land. The desert sky turned gold and orange and deep purple, and the air cooled enough to be pleasant. It was beautiful, peaceful, deceptive. "Hard to believe last night happened," Charlotte said when Ethan joined her on the porch. "Sitting here now, it all seems like a bad dream." "It happened," Ethan said, "and it'll happen again if Branson doesn't back down." "You think he will?" "No." Ethan's voice was flat, certain. "Men like him can't afford to back down. He threatened you publicly, and you humiliated him publicly. If he lets that stand, he loses respect, loses power. He'll come at you again, but he'll be smarter about it next time." Charlotte had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it said aloud made it more real, more frightening. "So what do I do?" "You prepare. You stand your ground. You show him that every move he makes will cost him more than he's willing to pay." Ethan turned to look at her. "But you should also know this could get very ugly. There might come a point where you have to decide if this land is worth dying for." "It is," Charlotte said without hesitation. "This ranch is all I have left of Thomas, of everything we dreamed about. I won't let Branson or anyone else take it." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then we'll make sure they can't." The days that followed fell into a tense routine. Charlotte ran the ranch during daylight hours, managing cattle handling correspondence, dealing with all the 1,000 small crises that came with operating a spread the size of the Circle M. But always in the back of her mind was the knowledge that they were waiting for something to happen for Branson to make his next move. Ethan proved to be worth every penny she paid him, and more. He was an excellent horseman, skilled with a rope, and could handle any ranch work Charlie threw at him. But it was his vigilance that Charlotte valued most. He seemed to have an instinct for danger, for patterns that didn't quite fit for things that weren't quite right. On the third day, he noticed fresh tracks near the eastern fence line, 2 riders who'd stopped and watched the ranch from a distance before riding away. On the 5th day, he intercepted a ranch hand from the neighboring spread who admitted after some pointed questioning that he'd been paid by Jack Branson to ask questions about the Circle M's finances and Charlotte's relationship with her hired men. On the 8th day, Charlotte's credit at the general store was suddenly refused, the clerk stammering that he'd received complaints about her character and couldn't extend credit to someone whose reputation was in question. Branson was waging a campaign of whispers and innuendo, trying to isolate her ruin. Her reputation? Make it impossible for her to do business in Tombstone. Charlotte gritted her teeth and paid cash for her supplies, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her through town. But it was wearing on her. She could feel the stress building, the constant vigilance taking its toll. She snapped at Miguel over a trivial mistake nearly brought Charlie to tears with a harsh criticism about fence repairs, and spent one entire evening sitting alone in her parlor, staring at Thomas's photograph and wondering if she was fighting a battle she couldn't win. That night, after the others had gone to the bunkhouse, Ethan found her on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling desert air. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly. Charlotte shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that man in the doorway of the line shack, the one you shot. I keep wondering if he had a family, if someone's mourning him." "He made his choice when he came through that door with a gun in his hand," Ethan said, settling onto the porch steps beside her chair. "You can't carry guilt for other people's bad decisions." "I keep thinking about what you said about whether this land is worth dying for. And I don't know anymore. Some days I think yes, absolutely. Other days," she pulled the shawl tighter, "other days I think maybe I should just sell out, take whatever price I can get and start over somewhere else." "Is that what you want?" "No, but I'm tired, Ethan. I'm so tired of fighting." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, coyotes yipping in the distance, the wind rustling through the mesquite, the soft sounds of horses moving in the corral. My mother used to say that being strong doesn't mean never getting tired, Ethan said finally. It means resting when you need to, gathering your strength, and then standing up again. You don't have to be strong every minute of every day, Charlotte. You're allowed to be human. Charlotte looked at him in the moonlight, at his serious face and steady eyes, and felt something shift inside her chest. Over the past week and a half, Ethan Cole had become more than just a hired hand, more than just a guard. He'd become someone she relied on, someone she trusted, someone whose presence made her feel less alone. It was dangerous, that feeling. She'd been alone for 3 years, and she'd convinced herself she preferred it that way. Safer. Simpler. But now, thank you, she said softly, for everything, for being here. Nowhere else I'd rather be, Ethan replied, and something in his voice made Charlotte's breath catch. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibilities and unspoken words. Then Ethan stood, breaking the spell. You should try to get some rest, he said. Tomorrow's another day and you'll need your strength. Charlotte nodded and rose as well. At the door she paused and looked back at him. Ethan? What you said about your mother, about her keeping her land and living on her own terms, I want that too. Whatever it costs. I know, Ethan said, and I'll help you get it. After Charlotte went inside, Ethan remained on the porch, his eyes scanning the darkness, watching for threats that might come from any direction. But part of his mind was still on the woman behind the locked door, on the strength and vulnerability he saw in her, on the way she made him feel things he'd thought he'd buried years ago. This was just a job, he told himself. Just another ranch, another woman who needed help. When this was over, when Branson was dealt with one way or another, he'd move on like he always did. That was safest for everyone. But even as he thought it, Ethan knew he was lying to himself. 10 days after the confrontation in the saloon, Jack Branson made his next move. Charlie spotted the riders first, 5 of them coming up the eastern trail in the late afternoon heat. He was mending fence near the creek when he saw them, and something about the way they moved purposeful, spread out like they were expecting trouble, sent him running for the ranch house. Charlotte was in her study going over supply orders when Charlie burst through the door, his face flushed and breathing hard. Riders coming in fast, Mrs. McKenna. 5 of them, and they ain't friendly looking. Charlotte was on her feet instantly, her hand automatically checking for the derringer in her pocket. Where's Ethan? North pasture with Miguel, checking on that sick heifer. He's a good 20 minutes away. Get him! Now! Take Bobby with you, ride hard. Charlotte moved to the window and looked out toward the eastern approach. She could see them now, dark figures against the dusty landscape, close enough that she could make out their horses' colors. Tell Miguel to bring the other men, everyone armed. Charlie hesitated. What about you? I'll be fine. I've got the Winchester and enough ammunition to hold them off until you get back. Now go. After Charlie left, Charlotte grabbed the rifle from its place by the door and checked the load with practiced efficiency. 16 rounds. She had 2 boxes of ammunition in her desk drawer, another box in her bedroom. Plenty to make anyone think twice about trying something stupid. She positioned herself at the front window where she had a clear view of the yard and the approaching riders. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. Whatever Branson had planned, she wouldn't face it cowering in fear. The riders came to a halt about 50 yards from the house, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Charlotte recognized 2 of them from the saloon that night, hard-faced men with guns worn low on their hips. The others were strangers, but they had the same look about them. Professional gunmen, not ranch hands, playing at being tough. And there in the center of the group sat Jack Branson himself on a fine bay gelding, dressed in his expensive suit despite the heat and dust. Charlotte opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, the Winchester held casually in her arms, but pointed in their general direction. The message was clear. She was armed, prepared, and not intimidated. Mr. Branson, she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. You're on private property. State your business or leave. Branson urged his horse forward a few steps close enough that she could see the cold anger in his eyes. The humiliation she'd dealt him in the saloon still burned, she could tell. Men like Branson never forgot being made to look weak in front of others. Mrs. McKenna, I've come to make you a final offer on your property. I'm not interested in selling. I've told you that repeatedly. Yes, well, circumstances have changed.
Branson smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You see, I've spoken with the bank. It seems there are some irregularities with your mortgage payments. Questions about whether you're current on your obligations. Charlotte felt ice form in her stomach. My payments are current. I have receipts for every transaction. Do you? That's interesting because the bank's records tell a different story. According to Mr. Whitmore at First National, you're 3 months behind. He's quite concerned about the loan becoming delinquent. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Charlotte also knew that Harlan Whitmore, the bank president, was a regular poker player at Branson's private games and that he owed Branson money. If Branson had gotten to him, convinced him to falsify the records somehow. I'll speak with Mr. Whitmore myself, Charlotte said evenly. I'm sure we can clear up any confusion. I'm afraid it's too late for that. The bank has already initiated foreclosure proceedings. Your property will be auctioned in 30 days unless you can pay the full amount of the loan. Branson paused, letting that sink in. Which I believe is somewhere around $8,000. Charlotte felt the ground shift under her feet. $8,000. She had maybe $2,000 in her accounts, another $1,000 in cattle she could sell if she had time. But not $8,000, not in 30 days. However, Branson continued, his voice smooth as oil. I'm prepared to be generous. I'll pay off your loan directly to the bank and give you an additional $2,000 for your trouble. All you have to do is sign over the deed and walk away. Clean and simple. That land is worth $20,000, and you know it, Charlotte said, her voice hard. You're trying to steal it. I'm trying to save you from losing everything. If the bank forecloses, you'll get nothing. At least this way you walk away with something. He leaned forward in his saddle. But this offer expires today, right now. You accept it, or you lose it all. Charlotte's mind raced, calculating options, looking for a way out. She could fight the foreclosure in court, but that would take time and money she didn't have. She could try to raise the capital, but no bank would lend to a woman whose credit had already been questioned. She could sell the cattle, but the market was down and she'd be lucky to get half what they were worth. Branson had her trapped, and he knew it. I need time to think about it, Charlotte said, stalling, hoping that Ethan and the others would arrive soon. You've had 3 years to think about it. Time's up. Branson gestured to one of his men who dismounted and pulled a leather document case from his saddlebag. I have the papers right here. All you need to do is sign. And if I refuse, then the foreclosure proceeds, and in 30 days, I'll buy your property at auction for a fraction of what I'm offering now. Either way, Mrs. McKenna, the Circle M will be mine. The only question is whether you want to leave with dignity and a little money in your pocket, or whether you want to be dragged out by the sheriff when the time comes. Charlotte raised the Winchester slightly, not quite pointing it at Branson, but making the threat clear. Get off my land. The men behind Branson tensed hands, moving toward their guns. But Branson held up a hand, stopping them. Are you really prepared to shoot me, Charlotte, in front of 5 witnesses? That would be murder, plain and simple. They'd hang you. Self-defense. You're threatening me on my own property with armed men backing you up. Any court would see it my way. Would they? Branson smiled. I wonder. A woman who pulls guns on respectable businessmen in saloons. A woman who's been living alone with hired men. No chaperone, no regard for propriety. A woman whose mental state might be questioned, whose judgment might be called into doubt. Charlotte felt rage building in her chest, hot and dangerous. He was going to destroy her reputation as thoroughly as he destroyed her finances, make sure that even if she fought this, no one would believe her or support her. You son of a bitch, she said quietly. Careful, Charlotte. Ladies don't use such language. Branson turned his horse slightly, preparing to leave. You have until sundown tomorrow to accept my offer. After that, we do this the hard way. And trust me, you don't want that. He was turning to ride away when Charlotte made her decision. She couldn't let him leave thinking he'd won, thinking she'd broken. Even if she had no idea how she was going to fight this, she had to show strength. Branson, she called out, you come back here tomorrow, you'd better bring an army. Because I'm not selling, not to you, not to anyone. This is my land, and I'll die on it before I give it to you. Something dark flickered across Branson's face. That can be arranged.
He spurred his horse and rode off his men following, leaving Charlotte standing alone on her porch, with her heart pounding and her mind spinning. She'd just made a declaration of war against a man who clearly had the resources and ruthlessness to follow through on his threats, and she'd done it without knowing if she could actually win. Charlotte was still standing there, trying to process what had just happened, when she heard the thunder of hooves approaching from the north. Ethan arrived first, his buckskin lathered with sweat, his colt already drawn. Charlie and the others were right behind him, spreading out defensively around the yard. "Where are they?" Ethan demanded, scanning for threats. "Gone. For now." Charlotte lowered the Winchester, suddenly feeling exhausted. "But they'll be back." She told them everything: the fake foreclosure, Branson's ultimatum, the implicit threats. As she spoke, she watched Ethan's face grow harder, more closed off, like a door slamming shut on any emotion. When she finished, Charlie let out a low whistle. "That's dirty, even for Branson. Can he really do that? Can he make the bank falsify records? If he's got Whitmore in his pocket, he can do whatever he wants," Miguel said grimly. "Banks have all the power. Woman tries to fight them. She's going to lose." "Not necessarily," Ethan said slowly. He'd dismounted and was pacing the yard, thinking. "Banks keep duplicate records, receipts, ledgers, correspondence. If Mrs. McKenna has her copies and they don't match the bank's records, that's evidence of fraud. Evidence isn't enough if the judge is friendly with Branson," Charlotte said bitterly, "and Judge Harding plays poker at his house every Thursday. Then we take it to the territorial court or to the newspapers. Make enough noise that they can't just sweep it under the rug." Ethan stopped pacing and looked at her. "But that takes time. And time is what Branson's counting on you not having." Charlotte sank down onto the porch steps, the Winchester across her knees. "So what do I do? What can I possibly do against someone with that much power and influence?" The men were silent, and Charlotte hated the helplessness she heard in her own voice. She'd been so strong, so determined not to let Branson break her. But maybe she'd been fooling herself. Maybe some fights couldn't be won with courage and a Winchester, so you fight dirty, Ethan said finally. If Branson's willing to commit fraud to get your land, then he's worried about something. Worried enough to take big risks. That means he's vulnerable somewhere. Vulnerable how? I don't know yet, but I'll find out. Ethan looked at Charlie. Double the watches tonight. Nobody gets onto this property without us knowing about it. Miguel, I want you to ride into Tombstone first thing tomorrow. Talk to people. See what you can find out about Branson's business dealings. Who he owes money to. Who he's in partnership with. Any deals that might be shady. You think he's done this before? Charlotte asked. Men like him don't suddenly wake up one day and decide to commit fraud. It's a pattern, a way of doing business. If we can find other people he's cheated, other properties he's stolen, we might be able to build a case that's bigger than just your ranch. It was a slim hope, but it was something. Charlotte nodded, feeling a little of her determination returning. All right. What do you need me to do? Gather every piece of paper related to your mortgage, every receipt, every letter, every record of payment. We'll need all of it. Ethan moved closer, and Charlotte caught the intensity in his eyes. And Charlotte, don't give up. Not yet. I've seen you face down 6 men with a Derringer. You're stronger than Branson thinks you are. That night, Charlotte sat at her desk going through 3 years of financial records, organizing everything into neat stacks. Ethan worked beside her, occasionally asking questions, making notes on a piece of paper. The oil lamp burned low as the hours stretched on, and outside the night guards made their rounds. Around midnight, Charlotte pushed back from the desk and rubbed her tired eyes. It's all there, every payment recorded and dated, proof that I'm current on the loan. Good. We'll take these to a lawyer in Benson, someone outside of Branson's influence. Get an official statement prepared. Ethan studied the papers spread across the desk. Your husband took out this loan 7 years ago when we first bought the land. We've been making payments ever since. And how much is still owed? About $5,000, not 8 like Branson claimed. Charlotte pulled out the most recent statement from the bank, which makes me wonder why he inflated the number. Ethan frowned, reading the statement carefully. Maybe because he knows if this goes to court, his fraud will be exposed. The higher the amount, the more desperate you'll be to settle quickly rather than fight. Or maybe he's testing me,
Charlotte said slowly, seeing if I know my own finances well enough to catch the lie. If I had accepted his offer without questioning the number, it would have been easier to claim I was incompetent, that I didn't understand my own business affairs. You're probably right. Ethan set down the papers and looked at her with something like admiration. You're smarter than he gives you credit for. Charlotte felt a warmth spread through her chest at the compliment, and she quickly looked away suddenly, very aware that they were alone in her house late at night, sitting close together in the lamplight. The situation would cause a scandal. If anyone knew, would fuel exactly the kind of gossip Branson was trying to spread about her character. But she didn't care. Not anymore. Her reputation was already being destroyed by lies and innuendo. At least this quiet companionship with a man who respected her intelligence and treated her as an equal was real. I should let you get some rest, Ethan said, standing up. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Ethan, Charlotte stood as well, and when he turned back to her, she found herself at a loss for words. How did you thank someone for believing in you when everyone else had written you off? How did you express gratitude that went deeper than just appreciation for a job well done? Thank you, she said finally, for everything, for not thinking I'm crazy for wanting to fight this. You're not crazy. You're brave. He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. Get some sleep, Charlotte. We'll figure this out. After he left, Charlotte extinguished the lamp and stood in the darkness of her study, listening to the night sounds outside. She should be terrified, she thought. She should be making plans to pack her belongings and leave. But instead, she felt something that had been missing for a long time: hope. And underneath that hope, something else she wasn't quite ready to name. Something that had to do with the way Ethan looked at her, the way he said her name, the way his presence made her feel less alone in the world. Dangerous thoughts for a widow fighting for her survival. But Charlotte had learned over the past few weeks that safety was an illusion anyway. Might as well be honest about what she wanted. Miguel returned from Tombstone the next afternoon with news that sent a chill through everyone on the ranch. Branson's been buying up properties all over the territory. Miguel reported, spreading a map on Charlotte's kitchen table. In the past 5 years, he's acquired 12 ranches and farms, all from widows or single women. Always the same pattern: financial pressure rumors about moral character, then swooping in with a low offer. 12 properties, Charlie breathed. That's not business, that's predatory. It gets worse, Miguel continued. 3 of those women disappeared after selling out. Just vanished, no forwarding address. No one knows where they went. Another one died in what they called an accident, fell down her own stairs the night before she was supposed to testify in court about Branson forcing her signature on documents. Charlotte felt sick. He's been killing women, getting away with murder. No proof, Miguel said. That's the thing. Everything looks legitimate on paper. Accidents happen, people move away all the time. But when you put all the pieces together, he shook his head. I talked to a lawyer in Tombstone, old guy named Henderson, who hates Branson. He said there have been whispers for years, but no one's been able to make anything stick. Branson's too careful, too connected. Ethan had been listening quietly, but now he leaned forward, studying the map. These properties, where are they located? Miguel pointed to various spots on the map, scattered across Arizona territory. All over, but there's a pattern. See, they form a rough line from here to Tucson, following the proposed route of the new railroad spur. He's not stealing land, Ethan said slowly. He's cornering the railroad right-of-way. When the railroad comes through, any property owner along that route can demand payment for access. Branson's positioning himself to make a fortune. That's why he's so determined to get the Circle M, Charlotte realized. My property sits right where the surveyors said the line would go. Without it, his chain is broken. Which means he can't afford to lose this fight, Ethan said grimly. He's probably invested everything in this scheme. If you hold out, if you block his plans, he could lose millions. The room went silent as everyone absorbed this information. Charlotte looked at the faces of her men, loyal, brave, but clearly frightened by the implications. They weren't just fighting a vindictive merchant anymore. They were fighting a man whose entire fortune depended on destroying her. So what do we do? Bobby asked, his young face pale. If he's that desperate, he might do anything. We prepare for the worst, Ethan said. Charlie, I want every weapon on this ranch cleaned and ready.
Miguel, you and Sam start building barriers we can use for cover in case they try a direct assault. Bobby, you're our fastest rider. I need you to take letters to every neighboring ranch, warn them what Branson's doing, ask them to watch our backs. Will they help? Charlotte asked doubtfully. Most of them are men who think I should have sold out years ago. Maybe, but nobody likes someone who cheats women and murders to get what he wants. Once they know what Branson really is, some of them might be willing to stand with us. Ethan turned to her. And you need to write to the territorial governor, the marshal service, anyone with authority above the local level. Lay out everything Miguel found, make formal accusations. Even if they don't act immediately, it creates a record. Makes it harder for Branson to claim you're just a hysterical woman making up stories. Charlotte nodded, already mentally composing the letters. It was a long shot. Territorial authorities were notoriously slow to act, and she had no proof of actual murder, just suspicious coincidences. But it was something. There's one more thing, Miguel said, looking uncomfortable. While I was in town, I heard that Branson's hired more guns, professional men from down near the border, the kind that don't ask questions as long as the money's good. How many? Ethan's voice was sharp. Word is at least 10, maybe more. Charlotte did the math quickly. With Branson's existing men, that put the enemy force at 15 or more against her 6 defenders. The odds were impossible. We need more men, Charlie said, voicing what everyone was thinking. Mrs. McKenna, you got any money left? We could hire— No, Charlotte interrupted. I can't ask men to die for my land. It's not right. Then what? Miguel spread his hands. We can't hold off that many men, not if they come all at once. We don't hold them off, Ethan said quietly. We make it too expensive for Branson to keep fighting. Everyone looked at him, and Charlotte saw something cold and dangerous in his eyes, something that reminded her of the soldier he'd been before he became a cowboy. What do you mean? She asked. Branson's spending money to hire these guns. Money he probably doesn't have much of if he's invested everything in the railroad scheme. Every day this drags on, every man who gets killed or injured, it costs him. We make this fight so bloody and prolonged that he runs out of resources before we do. Guerrilla tactics, Charlie said slowly. Hit and run, make them chase us, wear them down. Exactly. They want a siege, we give them a moving target. They want a battle, we give them 100 small skirmishes. Ethan looked at Charlotte. But I won't lie to you, it's going to be ugly. People will get hurt, probably killed. Your ranch might get damaged, and there's no guarantee it'll work. Charlotte thought about Thomas, about the dreams they'd had for this place, about the 3 years she'd spent proving everyone wrong about what a woman alone could accomplish. She thought about the 12 women Branson had already destroyed and the 3 who'd disappeared into silence. Do it, she said. Whatever it takes. That night, Charlotte couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed listening to the sounds of preparation, outside men moving equipment, building defensive positions, preparing for a war that seemed inevitable now. The moon was full and bright, casting silver light through her window, and she found herself thinking about all the ways this could end badly. She could lose the ranch. She could lose her life. She could watch good men die defending property that in the end was just dirt and buildings. Part of her wondered if she was being selfish, if she should just take Branson's money and disappear like those other women had. But another part of her, the part that was Thomas's wife and a sergeant's daughter, and a woman who'd survived 3 years of running a ranch alone, that part burned with fury at the injustice of it all. Why should she have to run? Why should she have to accept less than her property was worth, because some man decided he wanted what she had? A soft knock at her door startled her. Charlotte grabbed the Derringer from her nightstand and moved quietly to the door. It's me. Ethan's voice came through the wood. I saw your lamp was still on. You all right? Charlotte opened the door, suddenly very aware that she was in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. But Ethan kept his eyes respectfully on her face, and she saw genuine concern there. Couldn't sleep, she admitted. Keeps thinking about tomorrow, about what's coming. That's normal. Night before a fight, nobody sleeps well. You've been in a lot of fights, haven't you? Charlotte asked, studying his face in the lamplight. Real ones, I mean, not just bar brawls. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, more than I'd like to remember. Did you ever get scared? Every single time. He smiled slightly.
Fear keeps you alive if you're smart about it, makes you careful, makes you think before you act. Charlotte stepped back from the door in invitation. Come in.
I don't want to be alone right now. Ethan hesitated, clearly aware of the impropriety, but then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Charlotte moved to the window and looked out at her moonlit land at the ranch she'd built with Thomas and maintained alone. Do you think we can win? She asked. Honestly, I don't know. Branson has more men, more money, more influence. But he's also overconfident, and he's fighting for greed while we're fighting for survival. That counts for something. Charlotte turned to face him. And if we lose, if Branson wins despite everything, then we make sure you get out safely. Get you to California or Oregon, somewhere he can't reach you where you can start over. I don't want to start over. I want my home. I know. Ethan moved closer and Charlotte felt her breath catch at the intensity in his eyes. And I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you keep it. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and feelings that had been building for weeks. Charlotte knew she should step back, maintain the proper distance between employer and employee, between widow and hired hand. But she was so tired of being proper, of following rules that seemed designed to keep her small and controlled. Ethan, she said softly, if tomorrow goes badly, if this is the last peaceful night we have, I don't want to spend it alone. She saw him understand what she was asking, saw the conflict play across his face. Charlotte, I can't, this isn't, I know exactly what I'm doing. She reached out and took his hand, felt the calluses and strength there. I'm a grown woman making a choice. The same way I chose to stand up to Branson, the same way I chose to fight for my land. I'm choosing this too. People will talk. If anyone finds out, let them talk. They're already calling me a whore in town, already questioning my character. At least this way I'll have done something to deserve it. Ethan's hand tightened on hers. You deserve better than a drifter cowboy with nothing to his name. You're not nothing. You're the bravest, most decent man I've met since Thomas died. You're the only person who's looked at me and seen someone strong instead of someone helpless. Charlotte moved even closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body. And right now, tonight, you're exactly what I want. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move, didn't breathe. Then with a sound that might have been surrender or relief, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste kisses Charlotte had shared with Thomas in their courtship, nothing like the comfortable affection of their marriage. This was fierce and desperate, two people clinging to each other in the face of an uncertain future, taking comfort and pleasure where they could find it. Charlotte felt years of loneliness and restraint fall away as Ethan's hands moved through her hair, as his mouth explored hers with increasing urgency. She pulled him toward the bed, and he followed, and for a few precious hours they forgot about Branson and threatened foreclosures and impossible odds. They forgot about everything except each other. Later, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Charlotte lay in Ethan's arms and listened to his steady breathing. She should feel guilty, she thought, should feel ashamed of what they'd done, of the impropriety and scandal it would cause if anyone knew. But she felt nothing except contentment and a bone-deep certainty that this was right, that whatever happened in the days ahead, she wouldn't regret this night. Ethan stirred beside her, his eyes opening to meet hers. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning." Charlotte traced a finger along his jaw, memorizing his face. "Any regrets?" "None." He caught her hand and kissed her palm. None." They lay there in comfortable silence until the sounds of the ranch waking up forced them back to reality. Ethan dressed quickly, checking that the yard was clear before slipping out of Charlotte's room. To anyone watching, it would look like he was just starting his morning rounds early. But as Charlotte dressed and prepared to face the day, she knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer just employer and employee, no longer just allies in a fight. They were something more, something deeper, and that changed everything. The question was whether they'd survive long enough to figure out what that something was. Branson's deadline came and went without incident, which made Charlotte more nervous than if he'd shown up with his hired guns blazing. The silence felt ominous, like the stillness before a lightning strike. She spent the morning working with her hands to keep from going crazy with worry, helping Miguel repair a section of corral fence that had rotted through over the winter. The physical labor felt good, honest, and it kept her mind from dwelling on the night she'd spent in Ethan's arms. Every time she caught sight of him across the yard directing the men as they prepared defenses, she felt a flutter in her stomach that was entirely inappropriate given their circumstances. But she couldn't help it. Something had awakened in her that she'd thought died with Thomas, and now it refused to be put back to sleep. Charlie approached mid-morning, his face troubled. "Mrs. McKenna, we got a problem."
3 of the neighboring ranchers Bobby talked to yesterday. They sent messages back saying they can't help, don't want to get involved in what they're calling a personal dispute. Charlotte wiped sweat from her forehead, unsurprised but disappointed. Can't or won't. Both probably. Branson's got reach and folks are scared of him. Charlie hesitated. But there was one who said different. Old Dutch Keller from the Double K. He sent word that if things go bad, you're welcome to bring your stock onto his land. Says he remembers when Thomas helped him through that drought 5 years back, and he don't forget his debts. It was something at least. A lifeline if they needed to retreat. Thank Dutch for me. And make sure Bobby knows the route to the Double K in case we need to move cattle in a hurry. Yes, ma'am. Charlie glanced toward where Ethan was showing Sam how to create a defensive barrier using hay bales and boards. He's a good man, Cole. Knows what he's doing.
"We're lucky you found him." Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks and hoped Charlie would attribute it to the sun. "Yes, we are." After Charlie left, Charlotte returned to her work, but her thoughts kept circling back to the same question that had haunted her since dawn. What happened now between her and Ethan last night had been born of fear and desperation and need. But in the clear light of day, the complications were obvious. He worked for her. She was a widow trying to protect her reputation. They were in the middle of a life-or-death struggle with a powerful enemy. This was possibly the worst time in the world to start a romantic entanglement. And yet when Ethan looked at her across the yard when their eyes met and held, for just a moment too long, Charlotte knew she wouldn't take it back even if she could. The attack came 3 hours past noon when the sun was at its highest, and the heat made everything shimmer like a mirage. Miguel spotted them first, riding hard from the east, at least a dozen men spreading out as they approached. He fired a warning shot and shouted the alarm, and instantly the ranch exploded into organized chaos. Men ran to their assigned positions, grabbed weapons, took cover behind the barriers they'd spent the morning building. Charlotte sprinted for the house, her heart hammering, and grabbed the Winchester from where it leaned by the door. Through the window, she could see Branson's hired guns taking positions around the property, using rocks and trees and the terrain itself for cover. They weren't charging in blindly like amateurs. These were professionals who understood siege tactics. Ethan appeared at her side, breathing hard, his Colt already drawn. "They're going to try to pin us down, wait us out. We can't let them settle in." "What do? We make them uncomfortable." He moved to the window and studied the positions of the enemy. "See that group of 3 behind the water trough? And those 2 by the barn? If we can take them out, create gaps in their line, we might be able to break their formation." Charlotte peered out her hands tight on the Winchester. The men Ethan indicated were maybe 60 yards away, well within range, but using good cover. Hitting them would require skill and nerve. "I'll take the ones by the barn," she said. "You take the trough." Ethan looked at her sharply. "Charlotte, these aren't targets. These are men who'll shoot back." "I know what they are." She met his eyes steadily. "This is my land, my fight. I'm not hiding while others do the dangerous work." For a moment she thought he'd argue, but then he nodded. "All right, on my count. 1, 2, 3. They fired simultaneously, the reports of their weapons overlapping. Charlotte saw one of the men by the barn jerk and fall, and the other dove for better cover. Ethan's shot caught one of the men at the trough in the shoulder, sending him spinning away with a scream of pain. Immediately, return fire erupted from every direction. Bullets punched through the windows, shattered glass, thudded into the adobe walls. Charlotte dropped below the windowsill, her ears ringing, adrenaline singing through her veins. "Reload!" Ethan shouted, and Charlotte worked the Winchester's lever action, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. Outside, she could hear shouting, the crack of rifles, the deeper boom of a shotgun from where Charlie had positioned himself in the barn loft. The siege had begun. For the next 2 hours, the battle raged in waves of intense firing followed by tense silences. Charlotte learned to move between windows, never staying in one place too long, conserving ammunition, making every shot count. She hit 2 more men that she knew of, possibly a third, though she couldn't be sure through the gun smoke and dust. Ethan fought beside her with grim efficiency, calling out targets and directions, coordinating with the men outside through hand signals when the noise made shouting useless. Charlotte watched him in action and understood why he'd been a soldier. He had that rare quality of staying calm under fire, of thinking clearly when death was a heartbeat away. Around mid-afternoon, there was a lull in the fighting. Charlotte's arms ached from holding the Winchester and her throat was raw from breathing gun smoke. She moved to the kitchen and pumped water into a cup, drinking it down in desperate gulps. Ethan joined her, reloading his Colt with practiced motions. They're probing for weak points, testing our defenses. Once they figure out where we're thin, they'll concentrate their attack there. How long can we hold out? Ammunition. We're good for another day, maybe 2. Water and food were fine. The question is whether they're willing to wait us out or whether they'll try something stupid. As if in answer, one of Branson's men shouted from outside, "Mrs. McKenna, Mr. Branson wants to parley. Hold your fire." Charlotte and Ethan exchanged glances. "Could be a trap," Ethan said, "or it could be that we've hurt them worse than they expected and they want to negotiate." Charlotte moved to the front door. "Either way, I want to hear what he has to say." She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the Winchester held ready, but not aimed. Across the yard, perhaps 50 yards away, Jack Branson stood up from behind a rock formation, his expensive suit dusty and torn. He looked furious, his face red with heat and rage. "This is your last chance, Charlotte," he shouted. "Accept my offer and end this, or we burn you out. I've got men ready to torch the barn, the bunkhouse, everything. You'll lose it all." Charlotte felt her stomach drop. The building she could rebuild. But the horses in the barn, the supplies, the winter hay, those were irreplaceable. Without them, the ranch couldn't function. "You burn those buildings, you'll burn any evidence of fraud along with them," she shouted back. "The territorial marshal already has copies of my mortgage documents. They know what you tried to do." It was a bluff, a desperate gamble. The letter she'd written hadn't even been sent yet, let alone received and acted upon. But Branson didn't know that. She saw uncertainty flicker across his face, saw him hesitate. Then his expression hardened again. "You're lying. You got no proof of anything except that you're a crazy woman who's going to get everyone on this ranch killed?" He gestured to his men. "I'm giving you 1 hour, 1 hour, to come out with the deed to this property, signed over to me, or we burn everything to the ground and take our chances with the law. You think any jury will convict me for defending my own legal interests against armed resistance?" He disappeared back behind the rocks before Charlotte could respond. "He's desperate," Ethan said from behind her. "Men make mistakes when they're desperate. Or they do terrible things." Charlotte lowered the Winchester, her mind racing. "An hour isn't much time." "No, it's not. But it might be enough." "Enough for what?" Ethan's eyes had that distant look she'd seen before, like he was calculating angles and odds and possibilities. "When I was with the cavalry, we had a situation once where we were pinned down by a larger force. Couldn't retreat, couldn't hold out much longer. Our captain, he realized that the enemy was so focused on our position that they'd forgotten to guard their own rear." Charlotte understood immediately. "You want to flank them?" "Not me. Us. You, me, and Miguel. Charlie and the boys can keep up covering fire from here, make it look like we're all still in position. Meanwhile, we circle around through the creek bed, come up behind them. If we can scatter their horses, maybe take out a few of their men, we can break their nerve." "That's insane. If they catch us out in the open, they won't be looking for us. They think they've got us trapped." Ethan moved closer, his voice urgent. "Charlotte, we can't win by sitting here. Sooner or later they'll rush us or burn us out or just wait until we're too tired to fight effectively. This is our chance to take the initiative back." Every instinct Charlotte had screamed that this was too risky, too dangerous. But she also knew Ethan was right. Passive defense would only delay the inevitable. If they wanted to win, they had to be bold. "All right," she said. "Let's do it." 20 minutes later, Charlotte found herself crawling through the rocky creek bed that ran along the eastern edge of her property. The Winchester slung across her back, mud caking her dress and hands. Ethan led the way, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd done this kind of thing before. Miguel followed behind Charlotte, his rifle at the ready. The creek bed provided good cover, but made for slow going. They had to move carefully, avoiding loose rocks that might clatter and give them away. Above them, Charlotte could hear occasional gunfire as Charlie and the others kept up their defensive shooting, maintaining the illusion that the full force of defenders was still at the house. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Ethan held up a hand signaling them to stop. They'd traveled in a wide arc and were now behind the main concentration of Branson's men. Through the scrub brush and rocks, Charlotte could see their horses tied in a loose picket line, guarded by a single bored-looking man smoking a cigarette. Ethan gestured to Miguel, pointed to the guard, made a cutting motion across his throat. Miguel nodded and began creeping forward, moving with impressive stealth for a man of his size. Charlotte watched her heart in her throat as Miguel got closer, closer until he was right behind the unsuspecting guard. What happened next was brutally quick. Miguel's arm wrapped around the guard's throat from behind, cutting off any cry for help. They struggled for a few seconds, the guard's legs kicking, hands clawing at Miguel's arm. Then he went limp and Miguel lowered him silently to the ground. Charlotte felt sick. She'd shot at men during the siege, had maybe even killed some, but this was different. This was deliberate, personal, a kind of violence that made her understand just how dark this fight had become. But there was no time for moral qualms. Ethan was already moving toward the horses, and Charlotte followed. They reached the picket line, and Ethan began cutting the ropes that tied the animals while Miguel kept watch. The horses, sensing freedom, began to mill about nervously. "On 3, we spook them," Ethan whispered. "Drive them south away from Branson's men. That'll give us time to—" A shout cut him off. One of Branson's hired guns had wandered away from the main group and spotted them. He raised his rifle and Ethan's Colt was in his hand and firing before Charlotte could even process the threat. The man went down, but his dying shot echoed across the landscape like a thunder crack. "Now!" Ethan shouted, all stealth abandoned. "Run them!" Charlotte fired the Winchester into the air and Miguel did the same with his rifle. The horses panicked, rearing and screaming, and then the whole remuda stampeded south in a cloud of dust and pounding hooves. Without their mounts, Branson's men would be stranded, unable to pursue or escape easily. But the element of surprise was gone. Men were shouting, running toward them, raising weapons. Charlotte saw muzzle flashes, heard bullets whining past her head. She dropped to one knee and began firing the Winchester as fast as she could, worked the lever action, not really aiming, just trying to keep the enemy's heads down. Beside her, Ethan's Colt roared again and again, and she saw men fall or dive for cover. Miguel was firing too, his face set in grim lines. They were outnumbered, but had the advantage of surprise and better cover. For a few chaotic minutes, it was impossible to tell who was winning. Charlotte's world narrowed to the simple mechanics of shooting and reloading, of finding targets and squeezing the trigger. Her ears rang with gunfire. Smoke burned her eyes and throat. Then she heard it, the sound she'd been dreading and hoping for simultaneously. The distinctive crack of Charlie's buffalo gun from back at the ranch house, followed by the deeper boom of the shotgun. Charlie and the boys were joining the fight, firing on Branson's men, from behind catching them in a crossfire. Branson's hired guns broke. Charlotte saw it happen, saw the moment when professional soldiers realized they were in a losing fight and decided their pay wasn't worth dying for. They began retreating, running for what cover they could find, some heading toward where the horses had been, only to discover them gone. "Press them!" Ethan shouted, advancing and firing. "Don't let them regroup!" Charlotte followed, running forward in a crouch, the Winchester hot in her hands. She saw one man trying to rally his companions and put a bullet close enough to his head that he decided discretion was the better part of valor and fled. Another raised his hands in surrender, and Miguel moved in to disarm him. Within minutes, it was over. Branson's assault force scattered, some fleeing on foot across the desert, others hiding in whatever cover they could find and calling out surrender. Charlotte counted 8 men down, dead or wounded, and at least 5 captured. The rest had run. And there, standing alone near the rock formation where he'd issued his ultimatum, was Jack Branson himself. Charlotte walked toward him, the Winchester aimed at his chest, her finger on the trigger. Ethan moved beside her, his Colt steady. Branson's face was white with shock and fury. His expensive suit ruined, his carefully groomed mustache drooping with sweat. "It's over, Branson," Charlotte said, her voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. "Your men are dead or scattered. You've got nothing left." This isn't over, Branson spat. You can't prove anything. You attacked my men, that's murder. I'll have the law on you. You'll shut your mouth, Ethan interrupted coldly, before I shut it for you permanently. You hired gunmen to attack a woman on her own property. You committed fraud against the bank. You've done this to a dozen other women, and we've got proof. Proof what proof? But Branson's voice wavered. Charlotte smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Miguel spent yesterday in Tombstone talking to people gathering stories. 3 women you drove off their land who are willing to testify. Bank records that don't match. A pattern of threats and intimidation. The territorial marshal is getting a very detailed letter about all of it, along with copies of my mortgage documents that prove your foreclosure was fraudulent. It was still mostly a bluff. The women Miguel found were scattered and scared. The proof was circumstantial, but Branson didn't know that. She watched the realization dawn on his face that his carefully constructed scheme was falling apart. You can't. I have friends. I have influence. Had, Charlotte corrected. Past tense. Because when word gets out about what you did here about the men you got killed trying to steal my land, those friends will disappear faster than your hired guns did. She lowered the Winchester slightly, not quite aiming at him anymore, but keeping it ready. Here's what's going to happen, Jack. You're going to go to the bank first thing tomorrow morning and tell them there was an error in my mortgage records. You're going to personally ensure that my account is marked current and that I receive a written apology. Then you're going to leave Tombstone. Go to San Francisco or Denver or anywhere that isn't Arizona territory. Because if I ever see your face again, I will shoot you. And it will be self-defense, and everyone in this territory will testify on my behalf. Branson stared at her with naked hatred. You won't get away with this. I'll come back with what more hired guns. Go ahead. Try it. See how many men are willing to die for you after word spreads about what happened here today. Charlotte stepped closer, and this time she did aim the Winchester directly at his heart. Or you can cut your losses, take what money you have left, and start over somewhere else. Your choice. But make it fast because my patience is running out. For a long moment, Branson didn't move. Then slowly he reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather document case. He threw it at Charlotte's feet. The deed, he said bitterly, to the properties I already acquired. Take them. Give them back to whoever. I don't care anymore. He turned and began walking away, stumbling slightly over the rocky ground. After about 20 yards, he looked back one last time. You'll regret this, he called. Somehow, someday, you'll regret crossing me. I doubt it, Charlotte replied. They watched until Branson disappeared over the ridge, heading toward Tombstone on foot. Then Charlotte's legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the ground, the Winchester clattering beside her. The adrenaline that had been sustaining her drained away, leaving her shaking and nauseated. Ethan crouched beside her, his hand on her shoulder. You all right? I don't know. Charlotte looked at the bodies scattered across her property, at the blood soaking into Arizona soil, at the destruction and violence that had torn through her peaceful ranch. We won, didn't we? So why do I feel like this? Because you're human, Ethan said gently. Because killing isn't supposed to be easy, even when it's necessary. If you felt good about this, I'd be worried about you. Charlotte leaned against him, too tired to care about propriety anymore. Around them, Charlie and the others were emerging from their positions, checking on the wounded, securing the prisoners. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Charlotte of blood and fire. What happens now? She asked. Now we bury the dead, tend the wounded, and start putting your ranch back together. Ethan helped her to her feet. And tomorrow we make sure Branson keeps his word about the bank. And the day after that, we find those women Miguel talked about and help them get their land back. And after that, he smiled slightly. After that, we figure out what comes next. Charlotte picked up the Winchester and looked around at her land scarred by battle, but still hers still standing. She thought about Thomas and how proud he'd be that she'd fought for what they'd built. She thought about the other women Branson had victimized, and how maybe, just maybe, she'd helped set things right for them. And she thought about Ethan Cole, this mysterious drifter who'd walked into her life at exactly the right moment and helped her become stronger than she'd ever thought possible. What comes next, she said slowly, is that I need to figure out what to do about you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. About me? About us?
Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks again, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. About what happened last night. About what it means. What do you want it to mean? It was such a simple question, but the answer was complicated by 1,000 factors: propriety, reputation, what the town would say, what her ranch hands would think. But as Charlotte stood there in the fading light, surrounded by evidence of how close she'd come to losing everything, she realized that none of those complications mattered as much as she'd thought they did. I want it to mean that you stay, she said, not as a hired hand, as a partner, in the ranch and in everything else. She saw surprise flash across Ethan's face, followed by something that looked like hope. Charlotte, are you sure people will talk? They'll say terrible things about both of us. Let them talk. I've spent 3 years trying to live up to everyone else's expectations of what a proper widow should be. I'm done with that. Charlotte reached out and took his hand. You asked me once if this land was worth dying for. Well, it's also worth living for. And I want to live, Ethan, really live, not just survive. And I want to do it with you. For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. Then he pulled her close and kissed her right there in the open where anyone could see, and Charlotte kissed him back without hesitation or shame. When they finally broke apart, Charlie was standing a respectful distance away, trying not to smile. Mrs. McKenna, what should we do with the prisoners? Charlotte straightened her dress and tried to look dignified, though she suspected her flushed face and disheveled hair ruined the effect. Patch up any who are wounded. Give them water and food. Tomorrow we'll turn them over to the marshal and let the law deal with them. Yes, ma'am. Charlie glanced between her and Ethan, and now he was definitely smiling. And for what it's worth, you two look good together. Boss would have approved. After Charlie left, Charlotte turned to Ethan. He called Thomas boss, and past tense, first time anyone's done that. Things are changing, Ethan said. Is that all right? Charlotte looked around at her ranch, damaged but intact, bloodied but unbowed. She thought about the fight they'd won, and the new battles that would come with rebuilding, with establishing her relationship with Ethan, with helping the other women Branson had wronged. Yes, she said. Change is all right. Change is good. That night, after the dead were buried, and the wounded were tended, and the prisoners were secured in the barn under guard, Charlotte stood on her porch and watched the stars come out. The ranch was quiet, except for the normal sounds of night horses shifting in the corral, a coyote's distant howl, the soft murmur of men talking by the bunkhouse fire. Ethan appeared beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered one to Charlotte, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the moon rise over land that was finally truly secure. You think Branson will keep his word? Charlotte asked. About fixing the mortgage. Doesn't matter. Miguel made copies of everything before we sent the originals to the marshal. Even if Branson tries something, we've got proof. And more importantly, everyone in Tombstone knows what happened here today. Knows that you stood your ground and won. That changes things. Does it change what people will say about us? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Probably not. They'll still gossip, still judge. But you know what? Those people, the ones who judge you for finding happiness after Thomas died, for fighting for what's yours, for living life on your own terms, their opinions don't matter. The people who matter, the good people, they'll understand. Charlotte sipped her coffee and felt the truth of his words settle into her bones. She'd spent so much energy over the past 3 years worrying about what people thought, trying to be respectable and proper and above reproach. And it hadn't mattered at all. Branson had attacked her reputation anyway, had spread lies and innuendo despite her best efforts. But the people who really knew her, Charlie, Miguel, Dutch Keller, even Pete Murphy at the saloon, they'd stood by her, or at least refused to join the attacks against her. Their opinions were the ones that counted. When this is all settled, she said, when the legal mess is cleaned up and the ranch is repaired, I want to do something. What's that? I want to find those women Miguel talked about, the ones Branson drove off their land. I want to offer them their property back if they want it, or fair prices if they want to sell. And I want to make sure everyone knows what Branson really was, so it never happens to anyone else. Ethan smiled. That's going to make you some enemies. People who were in business with Branson, who benefited from his schemes. Good. Let them be enemies. I've already survived the worst they could throw at me. Charlotte set down her coffee cup and turned to face him fully. Ethan,
I meant what I said earlier, about wanting you to stay as a partner, but I need to know if that's what you want too, or if you're just being noble. Noble? Ethan laughed quietly. Charlotte, there's nothing noble about what I want. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to build something with you, work this land with you, grow old with you. I want everything, and I know that makes me selfish and greedy and probably 10 kinds of inappropriate given that I'm a hired hand and you're… Charlotte stopped his words with a kiss deep and thorough and full of promise. When she pulled back, she was smiling. I'm what a widow who's supposed to mourn forever, a woman who's supposed to be grateful for whatever crumbs life throws her way. I'm done being those things. She took his hand and interlaced their fingers. I'm Charlotte McKenna, owner of the Circle M Ranch, and I choose you. If that makes me scandalous, so be it. Then I guess we're both scandalous, Ethan said, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather be scandalous with. They stayed on the porch until late, making plans for the future, talking about everything and nothing, occasionally lapsing into comfortable silences. And when Charlotte finally led Ethan back into her house, she did so with her head held high, knowing that whatever gossip might follow, whatever judgments might be passed, she was living her life honestly and on her own terms. That was worth more than all the respectability in the world. The morning after this battle dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect Arizona day that made you forget how brutal the desert could be. Charlotte woke with Ethan's arm around her waist and sunlight streaming through her bedroom window, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness the moment consciousness returned. She turned carefully, not wanting to wake him, and studied his face in the soft light. There were lines around his eyes she hadn't noticed before, a small scar on his temple, the shadow of beard stubble along his jaw. He looked younger in sleep, more vulnerable, and Charlotte felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. This man had risked his life for her, had stood beside her when everyone else had either abandoned her or actively worked against her, had seen her at her weakest and never once made her feel small or incapable. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges they faced, she knew with absolute certainty that she wanted him in her life. Ethan's eyes opened and he smiled when he saw her watching him. Morning? Morning? Charlotte traced a finger along his collarbone, marveling at the simple intimacy of the gesture. We should probably get up. Charlie and the others will be wondering where we are. They know where we are, Ethan said, pulling her closer. And they're probably smart enough to give us a few extra minutes before they come knocking. Charlotte laughed and let herself relax against him, storing up this moment of peace before they had to face the hard work of cleanup and consequences. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ranch coming to life, horses whinnying, men's voices calling to each other, the creak of the barn door opening. What do you think will happen when we go out there? She asked. When everyone sees that you spent the night in my house. Honestly, I think Charlie and Miguel already figured it out yesterday when we kissed in the yard, and I think they're fine with it. Ethan stroked her hair gently. Your men are loyal to you, Charlotte. They respect you. They're not going to judge you for finding happiness. And the town can go to hell. He said it so matter-of-factly that Charlotte couldn't help but smile. Anyone who matters will understand. Anyone who doesn't understand doesn't matter. A knock at the front door interrupted them, and Charlie's voice called out carefully, neutral. Mrs. McKenna, sorry to disturb you, but we got a situation. Charlotte dressed quickly, pinning her hair back into some semblance of order, while Ethan pulled on his clothes and strapped on his gun belt. They emerged from the bedroom together, and if Charlie noticed or cared, he gave no sign. What's the situation? Charlotte asked. 2 things. First, one of the prisoners died during the night, infection from his wounds. Miguel's got the body wrapped and ready for burial. Charlie paused. Second thing is more complicated. There's a woman here asking to see you. Says her name is Sarah Hendricks and that Jack Branson stole her land 4 years ago. Charlotte exchanged glances with Ethan. Where is she? On the porch. Wouldn't come inside, said it wasn't proper until you invited her. The woman waiting on the porch was perhaps 40 years old, thin and worn-looking, with graying brown hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a faded calico dress that had been mended multiple times, and her hands were work-roughened and scarred. But her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and when she looked at Charlotte, there was a mixture of hope and desperation in her expression. Mrs. McKenna, she said, I'm sorry to come unannounced, but I heard what happened here yesterday. Heard that you stood up to Jack Branson and won, and I thought maybe if the stories are true, maybe you could help me." "Please come in," Charlotte said, stepping aside. "You must be tired. Have you had breakfast?" Sarah Hendricks looked like she might cry at the simple kindness. "No, ma'am. I rode most of the night to get here. Couldn't wait. Couldn't risk missing my chance." Over coffee and biscuits in Charlotte's kitchen, Sarah told her story. It was depressingly similar to what Charlotte herself had faced, a widow trying to run a small farm debts that suddenly appeared in bank records, pressure to sell threats against her character. But Sarah had given in, had signed over her land for a fraction of its value, and taken the money Branson offered. "I used it to open a boarding house in Tucson," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "Told myself I'd done the smart thing, that I couldn't fight someone like Branson. But that farm was my husband's dream. We built it together, and I gave it away because I was scared." She looked up at Charlotte with tears streaming down her weathered face. "When I heard you fought back, that you won, I had to come. Had to see if it was real." Charlotte reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "It's real. And you didn't give anything away. Branson stole from you, same as he tried to steal from me. But we're going to make it right." "How?" "The deed's in his name now. The law says fraud is a crime," Ethan interrupted. He'd been standing quietly by the window, but now he moved closer. "If we can prove Branson falsified records, coerced you into signing the sale, can be invalidated. You could get your land back." Sarah shook her head hopelessly. "I don't have proof. I was so upset when it happened, I just took the money and ran. Didn't keep copies of anything." "But the bank has records," Charlotte said, an idea forming. "And if their records show the same kind of irregularities as mine did, it establishes a pattern." Miguel said he found 2 other women willing to talk. "If we can get all of you together, if we can present a united case to the territorial authorities, they'll have to investigate." "You'd do that?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "You'd help me even though we've never met." "Of course I would. What Branson did to you, he tried to do to me. The only difference is I had help when I needed it." Charlotte squeezed Sarah's hand. "Now I'm going to help you." Over the next week, Charlotte's ranch became an unlikely headquarters for a group of women seeking justice. Miguel had tracked down 3 of Branson's victims who were willing to testify, and through them they found 2 more. They gathered in Charlotte's parlor, 6 women ranging in age from 25 to 60, all of them widows or single women, all of them robbed of their property through similar schemes. Charlotte listened to their stories with growing fury. Branson hadn't just been greedy. He'd been systematic, targeting the most vulnerable women in the territory, using their grief and isolation and society's prejudices against them. And he'd gotten away with it for years because no one had thought to believe a woman's word over a respected businessman's. "We need to organize," Charlotte said during one of their meetings. "Present a unified case. Show that this wasn't just individual business disputes, but a calculated pattern of fraud and intimidation." "Who's going to believe us?" asked Mary Curtis, a widow in her 50s who'd lost a valuable mining claim. "We're just women. Half the territory thinks we should have sold our property anyway, that we had no business trying to manage it ourselves." "Then we make them believe us," Charlotte replied. "We get lawyers. We get statements from everyone who witnessed Branson's threats. We find allies who are willing to stand up for what's right." "That costs money," Sarah pointed out. "Good lawyers aren't cheap, and most of us barely have enough to live on after what Branson did." Charlotte had been thinking about this problem. "I'll pay for it. Legal fees, travel expenses, whatever we need. Consider it an investment in justice." The women stared at her in shock. "Mrs. McKenna, we can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering." Charlotte looked around the room at these women who'd been beaten down, but not broken, who'd found the courage to fight back even when the odds seemed impossible. "Besides, Branson gave me the deeds to all the properties he'd already acquired. That means legally I own your land right now, and I'm going to give it back to you free and clear as soon as we can arrange the transfers." The silence that followed was profound. Then Mary Curtis started crying, and within moments all 6 women were weeping and hugging Charlotte and each other. Ethan, standing in the doorway, caught Charlotte's eye and nodded his approval. This was what victory looked like. Not just winning her own battle, but helping others win theirs. The legal process took months. Charlotte hired the best lawyer in the territory, a sharp-minded woman named Elizabeth Morrison, who'd made a career of taking cases other lawyers wouldn't touch. Together, they built a case that was too comprehensive and well-documented for even the most corrupt officials to ignore. During this time, Charlotte and Ethan settled into a partnership that scandalized Tombstone society, but made perfect sense to everyone on the Circle M. They worked together during the day, repairing the damage from the battle, expanding the herd, improving the ranch's infrastructure. At night, Ethan slept in Charlotte's bed, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Charlie approached Charlotte one evening, about a month after the battle. "Mrs. McKenna, I feel like I should tell you something. There's talk in town about you and Cole." "I know," Charlotte said calmly. She was mending a bridle, her hand steady despite the uncomfortable conversation. "Some folks are saying you're living in sin, that it's shameful you being a widow and all. Do you think it's shameful, Charlie?" The old foreman was quiet for a moment. "No, ma'am. I think you got a right to happiness same as anyone. And Cole treats you like an equal. That's more than most married women can say about their husbands." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable but determined. "Just wanted you to know what's being said in case you wanted to do something about it." Charlotte set down the bridle and looked at her foreman directly. "Thank you for telling me, but I'm not going to change my life based on what a bunch of gossips think. Ethan and I are building something together, and we're doing it honestly and on our own terms. If people can't accept that, that's their problem, not ours." Charlie smiled. "That's what I figured you'd say. And for what it's worth, the boys and I got your back. Anyone gives you trouble, they'll have to go through us. But the trouble when it came wasn't from town gossips. It came from an unexpected source." 3 months after the battle, a well-dressed couple arrived at the ranch in an expensive carriage. They introduced themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Harold Branson, Jack Branson's parents from Philadelphia. They'd come, they said, to discuss the situation regarding their son. Charlotte received them in her parlor with Ethan standing beside her, his presence both support and warning. The elder Bransons were imposing people. Harold was a silver-haired industrialist with cold eyes, and his wife Margaret had the kind of pinched, disapproving expression that suggested she'd been born judging others. "Mrs. McKenna," Harold Branson began without preamble, "my son has informed us of the difficulties he experienced in Arizona. He tells us you orchestrated a violent attack against him and his associates, causing multiple deaths and considerable financial losses." Charlotte kept her voice even. "Your son tried to steal my land through fraud and intimidation. When that didn't work, he hired gunmen to force me off my property. I defended myself, which is my legal right." "My son would never engage in such behavior," Margaret said icily. "He's a respected businessman from a good family. You, on the other hand, are a woman of questionable character who has been living in sin with this man." She gestured dismissively at Ethan. "Is it any wonder Jack questioned your stability?" Ethan's hand moved to his gun, but Charlotte touched his arm, gently stopping him. "Mrs. Branson, your son defrauded at least 6 women that we know of, possibly more. He falsified bank records, made illegal threats, and hired men to commit violence. These aren't accusations. We have documented proof and multiple witnesses. The territorial marshal is currently investigating, and we expect formal charges to be filed within the month." Harold Branson's expression didn't change. "Documents can be falsified. Witnesses can be bought. My son made mistakes in judgment, certainly, but nothing criminal. And he's willing to let all of this go to drop any potential legal action against you if you agree to reasonable terms." "What terms?" Charlotte asked, though she could already guess. "You withdraw your complaints to the authorities. You return the property deeds Jack gave you. You make a public statement admitting that you overreacted to what was simply an aggressive business negotiation." Harold leaned forward. "In return, Jack will not pursue civil or criminal charges against you for the deaths of his employees. He'll leave Arizona and never bother you again." Charlotte laughed sharp and bitter. "Your son murdered at least 1 woman and drove 3 others into hiding. He destroyed lives and livelihoods for profit, and you want me to help him escape justice?" "I want you to be reasonable," Harold said coldly. "Do you really think the authorities will side with a collection of hysterical women over a man from one of Philadelphia's oldest families? Do you think your reputation, already damaged, will survive a lengthy court battle? Be smart, Mrs. McKenna. Take the deal." "No." Charlotte stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. Your son is a criminal, and he's going to face the consequences of his actions. You can hire all the fancy lawyers you want, but the evidence is overwhelming. Now get off my property." Margaret Branson rose as well, her face flushed with anger. "You'll regret this. We have influence connections. We can make your life very difficult." "You're welcome to try," Ethan said quietly, his first words since the Bransons arrived. "But just so you know, there are 6 women who've lost everything because of your son. Women who have nothing left to lose. If any mysterious accidents happen to Mrs. McKenna, if any more violence comes her way, those women know where to find Jack, and they know where to find you." It was a threat clear and unmistakable. Harold Branson's eyes narrowed, but he took his wife's arm and headed for the door. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes," Charlotte replied. "It is." After they left, Charlotte sank back into her chair, trembling with suppressed anger and adrenaline. "They were trying to intimidate me, make me back down." "They failed," Ethan said, crouching beside her chair. "You stood your ground. But they scared me. What if they do have that much influence? What if they can make the charges go away? Then we go public. Newspapers, politicians, anyone who'll listen, make so much noise that they can't sweep it under the rug." Ethan took her hand. "Charlotte, you've already won the hard part. You survived. You fought back. You exposed him. The rest is just details." Charlotte wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her. She'd underestimated Branson once, before assumed that defeating him in battle would be the end of it. But powerful men had powerful families, and the Bransons clearly weren't going to let their son's disgrace go unchallenged. The territorial marshal's investigation concluded 2 weeks later with a report that was frustratingly inconclusive. While acknowledging irregularities in Jack Branson's business dealings, the report stated that there was insufficient evidence to file criminal charges. The deaths during the battle at the Circle M were ruled as occurring during mutual combat, with fault assigned to both sides equally. Charlotte read the report in her kitchen, her hands shaking with rage. "This is impossible. We gave them everything documents testimony witnesses. How can they say there's insufficient evidence?" Elizabeth Morrison. Her lawyer looked grim. "The Bransons got to someone. Either the marshal himself or someone above him. Money changed hands, favors were called in. I've seen it before." "So that's it, Branson gets away with everything?" "Not everything. The civil suits are still pending. We can't put him in jail, but we can bankrupt him, tie up his assets in litigation for years. And we can make sure every newspaper in the territory knows what kind of man he is. Sometimes public disgrace is more effective than criminal prosecution." It wasn't the justice Charlotte had hoped for, but it was something. Over the following months, Elizabeth Morrison proved to be worth every penny Charlotte paid her. She filed lawsuits on behalf of all 6 women, presented evidence in court that was so damning, even Branson's expensive lawyers couldn't explain it away, and gave interviews to every newspaper reporter who would listen. The story of Jack Branson's systematic fraud against widows and single women spread throughout the territory and beyond. Eastern newspapers picked it up as an example of lawlessness in the West. Women's rights advocates used it as evidence of why women needed better legal protections. Branson's business empire crumbled as partners and investors withdrew their support, and slowly, painfully, the women he'd victimized got their land back. Sarah Hendricks stood in the yard of her reclaimed farm, tears streaming down her face, and hugged Charlotte so tightly she could barely breathe. "I never thought I'd see this place again. Never thought I'd have a chance to make things right." "You've got your chance now," Charlotte said. "What are you going to do with it?" Sarah looked around at the property she'd thought was lost forever, the fields her husband had cleared the house they'd built together, the creek where they'd planned to raise children. "I'm going to live. Really live, not just survive, same as you." Similar scenes played out across Arizona territory as the other women reclaimed their properties. Some chose to stay and rebuild. Others sold their land this time for fair prices, and on their own terms, and used the money to start fresh elsewhere. But all of them left with their dignity intact and their stories heard. Charlotte kept 2 of the properties for herself, the ones whose owners had disappeared and couldn't be found. She hired managers to run them, investing the profits into a fund to help other women in difficult situations. It wasn't charity. Charlotte hated the condescension of charity, but rather a form of practical support, offering loans and resources to women who wanted to start businesses or keep farms running. "You're building something bigger than just a ranch.
Ethan observed one evening as they went over the accounts for the Women's Fund. "I'm building what should have existed all along," Charlotte replied. "A system that doesn't automatically assume women are helpless or incompetent." Thomas and I used to talk about this, about how many talented people never got a chance because of who they were born as. I can't fix everything, but I can fix this little piece of it. As fall turned to winter, Charlotte and Ethan finally addressed the question that had been hovering unspoken between them for months. They were sitting on the porch on a cool December evening, wrapped in blankets, and watching the first snow of the season dust the distant mountains. "We should probably talk about making this official," Ethan said carefully. Charlotte knew what he meant. "You mean getting married?" "Yes. I know you've been avoiding the subject, and I understand why. But Charlotte, we've been living as husband and wife for 8 months now. Everyone knows it, and I'd like to actually be your husband, not just the man you're living in sin with." Charlotte was quiet for a long time, trying to sort through her complicated feelings. She loved Ethan, that wasn't in question. She wanted him in her life permanently. But marriage meant giving up a certain amount of legal autonomy. Under territorial law, a married woman's property became her husband's property. Everything she'd fought so hard to keep would technically belong to Ethan. "I'm afraid," she admitted finally. "Afraid of losing control of the ranch of my independence. I know you'd never try to take it from me, but the law says—" "Then we change what the law says," Ethan interrupted. "Elizabeth Morrison told me about something called a prenuptial agreement. We can specify in writing that the Circle M remains your sole property, that I have no claim to it. We can put whatever protections you need into the marriage contract." "You'd do that, most men would be insulted by that kind of arrangement." Ethan turned to face her fully. "Charlotte, I don't want to marry you for your land. I want to marry you because I love you, because I can't imagine my life without you, because every morning I wake up grateful that I walked into that saloon in Tombstone. The ranch is yours. It'll always be yours. I just want to be yours too." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears this time. "I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes." "Then marry me. Let's do this right, legal and proper, so nobody can ever question it." "All right," Charlotte said, smiling through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed on a cold January morning in a small ceremony at the Circle M. Charlotte wore a simple blue dress that had been her mother's, and Ethan wore new clothes. Charlie and the boys had pooled their money to buy him. Elizabeth Morrison served as witness, along with all 6 of the women they'd helped reclaim their property. The ceremony was performed by a justice of the peace from Benson, deliberately avoiding Tombstone and its poisonous gossip. Charlotte spoke her vows clearly and firmly, promising to love and honor, but notably not to obey a detail that made Ethan smile. When it was done, when they were legally husband and wife, Charlotte felt a sense of completeness she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. This was different from her first marriage, she realized. She'd loved Thomas, but they'd been young and following a script society had written for them. This marriage to Ethan was built on equality and respect and a deep understanding of each other's strengths and weaknesses. They were partners in the truest sense, each bringing different skills and perspectives to their shared life. The reception was held in Charlotte's barn, decorated with evergreen boughs and lit with dozens of oil lamps. Cowboys and women who'd fought Branson mingled and danced and celebrated. Dutch Keller from the Double K showed up with a barrel of whiskey and a blessing from the old-timers in the territory. Even Pete Murphy from the Silver Star came bringing his best wishes and a story about how Charlotte's showdown with Branson that first night had become legend in Tombstone. As Charlotte danced with her new husband, she looked around at the people who'd become her community, not the judgmental gossips in town, but these brave, loyal, honest souls who'd stood by her through the worst of it. This was her real family now. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, holding her close as they swayed to music played by Miguel on a borrowed fiddle. "That I'm happy, genuinely, completely happy." Charlotte rested her head on his shoulder. 3 years ago, when Thomas died, I thought happiness was over for me. Thought the best I could hope for was survival. But you showed me I was wrong. "We showed each other," Ethan corrected. "You think I wasn't just surviving before I met you, drifting from place to place, never putting down roots because I was afraid of getting hurt again.
You gave me a reason to stay to build something permanent. They danced until late, and when the last guest had left and the lamps were extinguished, Charlotte and Ethan walked hand in hand back to the house they now officially shared. The Circle M spread out around them in the moonlight, peaceful and secure, a testament to everything they'd fought for. In the months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Charlotte and Ethan ran the ranch together, each respecting the other's expertise and decisions. They expanded the cattle operation, improved the breeding stock, and built a reputation for quality that attracted buyers from as far away as California. The Women's Fund grew as more women heard about it and either contributed or applied for assistance. Elizabeth Morrison became a regular visitor, often bringing cases she thought Charlotte might be interested in supporting. And slowly, grudgingly, even Tombstone Society began to accept Charlotte's unconventional choices. When you were successful and prosperous and willing to help your neighbors, people were more forgiving of your personal arrangements. When Charlotte and Ethan attended church together, sitting in the pew where she used to sit alone, fewer eyebrows were raised. When they went to town for supplies, fewer whispers followed them. It helped that Jack Branson had been thoroughly discredited and run out of the territory. His parents had tried to rehabilitate his reputation, but the weight of evidence against him was too great. He'd fled to Mexico, according to rumors, where his family's influence couldn't reach and his crimes couldn't follow him. The bank president who'd helped him was forced to resign in disgrace. The judge who'd played poker at Branson's house found himself investigated and eventually removed from the bench. Charlotte's stand against Branson had exposed a network of corruption that went deeper than anyone had realized, and in cleaning it out, the territory became just a little more fair. One evening in late spring, Charlotte and Ethan sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Charlotte's hand rested on her still flat stomach, hiding a secret she'd discovered just that morning. "I have news," she said quietly. Ethan turned to her, concern flickering across his face. "What kind of news?" "The good kind. Or at least I think it's good." Charlotte took his hand and placed it over her stomach. "We're going to have a baby. Sometime in the fall, I think." For a moment, Ethan didn't react. Then his face broke into the widest smile Charlotte had ever seen, and he pulled her into his arms with a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the nearby corral. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Charlotte asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it." Ethan kissed her softly. Terrified, excited, grateful, amazed, all of those things at once. They held each other as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared. Charlotte thought about the journey that had brought her here, the grief and fear and determination, the battles fought and won, the unexpected love that had bloomed in the middle of chaos. She thought about Thomas and how she'd honor his memory by living fully and fearlessly, building on the foundation they'd created together. She thought about the child growing inside her, who would be born into a world where women could own property and run businesses and make their own choices. Not a perfect world, not yet, but a better one than existed when Charlotte first became a widow. "What should we name it?" Ethan asked, his hand still resting on her stomach. "If it's a boy, I was thinking Thomas, after my first husband." Charlotte looked at Ethan carefully, watching for any sign of jealousy or resentment, but he just nodded. "That's good. Thomas was a good man, and he'd be proud of what you've done with the ranch he started. And if it's a girl, I don't know, something strong, something that says she can be whatever she wants to be." "Like her mother," Ethan said, and Charlotte heard the love and respect in his voice. They stayed on the porch until the chill of the evening drove them inside, making plans for the future and dreaming about the child who would carry their legacy forward. Inside the house, Charlotte paused by the photograph of Thomas that still held a place of honor on the mantel. "Thank you," she whispered to the image, "for building this place with me, for believing I could keep it going, for choosing me as your partner all those years ago." Ethan appeared beside her, understanding what she was doing without needing explanation. "He'd be happy for you, for both of us." "I think so too." Charlotte turned away from the past and toward the future, toward the life she'd fought so hard to build and protect. "Come on, let's go to bed. Tomorrow's going to be busy."
Tomorrow's always busy on a ranch, Ethan agreed, following her toward their bedroom, but that was all right. Charlotte had learned that busy was good, that hard work and full days left no room for regrets or what-ifs. She'd learned that happiness wasn't something that happened to you, but something you fought for and claimed and defended with everything you had. She'd learned that being a woman in a man's world didn't mean being helpless or weak. It meant being twice as strong, twice as smart, and twice as determined. It meant standing your ground even when everyone told you to run. It meant choosing your own path even when society tried to choose for you. And most importantly, she'd learned that love could find you when you least expected it, that it was never too late for a second chance, that the scars you carried from past battles made you stronger rather than weaker. As Charlotte drifted off to sleep that night, safe in Ethan's arms, with the promise of new life growing inside her, she thought about how far she'd come from that terrified widow, standing alone at her husband's grave. She'd survived, thrived, and helped others do the same. She'd transformed from victim to victor, from hunted to hunter. The Derringer Thomas had given her still rested in the drawer of her nightstand, cleaned and loaded ready if she ever needed it again. But Charlotte hoped those days were behind her now. She'd fought her battles and won her wars. Now it was time to live in the peace she'd earned to build the future she'd defended so fiercely. Outside, the wind whispered through the mesquite, and the coyotes sang their ancient songs to the desert moon. The Circle M Ranch stood solid and enduring, a monument to courage and love and the unbreakable will of a woman who'd refused to be broken. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the Arizona desert once more, Charlotte McKenna Cole would be there to greet it, ready for whatever challenges and joys the new day might bring. Because she was a survivor, a fighter, and a woman who'd learned that the only limitations on her life were the ones she accepted. She'd stopped accepting limitations the night she pressed a Derringer to Jack Branson's chest and told him no. Everything that came after the battles, the victory, the love, the new life growing inside her, all of it flowed from that single moment of defiance. And Charlotte knew with absolute certainty that she'd make the same choice again in a heartbeat. Because a life lived on your own terms, no matter how hard fought, was worth infinitely more than a life of quiet submission and slow death by 1,000 compromises. She'd chosen to live, really live, and that made all the difference.